Nord Stream 2. Walter, is any other panel discussing Nord Stream 2, or is that just our panel?
There was mention of it yesterday in both panels, and actually Pani Hopko said it was an important issue, even in terms of internal issues in Ukraine.
Well,
both Ariel and Anders have been eloquent on the Nord Stream 2 issue, so I think this will be a great panel to discuss that.
Yeah, and Mr. Hunchad is
Okay.
someone
Good.
who goes back way back on that issue. So yes,
thank you. But I think more broadly, what's important to stress that as long as the conflict is continuing, buying energy from Russia, be it electricity or coal, is self-defeating. That's my position. I mean,
wonderful.
Somebody will disagree, especially if they're making a lot of money of that. I'm not.
Very good, Errol.
Good.
Very good, Errol.
all right. I have just turned us on so we can be broadcasting on YouTube and Facebook. So it's really whenever you're ready, Walter, to begin this.
Okay, so we're just about thinking. We said 9:50. We might be able to, with my short remarks and stuff like that. That's 90 seconds, and then Mickey could probably then start at 9:50.
Yeah.
So we could, if there, I see that there are people have already joined in.
Correct.
You've got people in, so maybe, maybe. All right, then let's begin this thing. Okay.
Yep. You're on.
All right. Welcome, dear friends of Ukraine, to the second day of the US-Ukraine Security Dialogue 12. I will start the proceedings by simply and quickly repeating the mandate of this year's Security Dialogue affair. In the wake of the Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity, and the subsequent Russian-Ukrainian conflict, 2014 to 15, the original goals of the SD series, assessing US-Ukraine defense cooperation in patrolling, policing global hotspots, and monitoring the pace of Ukraine's accession to NATO, found 4 new and compelling markers for discussion in security matters. 1, possible US aid to Ukraine to help stop external, i.e. Russian aggression. 2, possible US aid to Ukraine to stop internal, i.e. political subversion. 3, possible US aid to enhance Ukraine's economic and energy security. And 4, possible US aid to counter disinform and cyber operations aimed against Ukraine. Security dialogues 7 to 10, that is from 2016 to 2019, each chose one of the stated markers to study in depth. Together, the events produced a cornucopia of very fresh and productive ideas and plans, some of which have already seen the light of day. Things like the Javelin, the light boats that are now being provided by both the United States and now Britain. Last year at the Security Dialogue 11, all 4 markers were revisited, but with the intention of seeing whether the newly elected President Zelensky, and the newly constituted Ukrainian parliament, were as committed to the discussion as their post-Euromaidan predecessors had been. This year, the security dialogue is mandated to repeat the process with regard to revisiting the 4 markers, but is attempting to divine the intentions and plans of the new US presidential administration and the somewhat reconstituted Congress with regard to US-Ukraine, the US-Ukraine security matrix. President Biden has long been known as a friend of Ukraine, much like his GOP buddy and counterpart, John McCain. The question is whether that will translate into substantial policy change in terms of US-Ukraine defense assistance issues, in particular, matters like the ones we've been discussing for the last 5-6 years, and 2, the military ties in general, matters like actively restarting the NATO accession process for Ukraine or deepening the enhanced partnership links. Yesterday, we opened the event by touching upon what the Ukrainian government might expect from the new administration and the partially revamped Congress, and eventually concentrated on divining what the new key players in DC might do with regard to further assisting in Ukraine's struggle to contain, prevent external aggression and internal subversion. At this point, yours truly traditionally would take a couple of minutes to review the remarks of a truly magnificent set of assessors. But this morning, we will use the time to read a summary assessment of the first day's topic by the person who was to appear in that role as last word yesterday, but was caught up by technical difficulties while visiting the Eastern Front. Deputy Head of the Office of the President on National Security, Defense, and Defense Industry Affairs, Mr. Roman Mushevets. I will ask my colleague at the Center for US-Ukrainian Relations as its DC Bureau Chief and concurrently President of the Organization for the Defense of Four Freedoms for Ukraine, Mr. Mykola Hryskubyan, to read Mr. Mushevets' remarks. Mykola, would you be ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Okay, these are notes that were sent over yesterday, right when it became apparent that Mr. Mushevets was not able to attend. He had hoped to the very last minute that he would be able to attend the final session, but he sent over these notes and he asked if they could be read and circulated. So this is from Mr. Mushevets, the deputy head of the Ukrainian presidential administration, and his responsibilities are national defense and security. Okay, possible Russian actions against Ukraine for the spring and autumn period of 2021. Ukrainian measures in neutralizing Russian influence inside our country are considered by the Kremlin as a threat to their positions and a loss for Russia in Ukraine. Given this, Moscow will adjust some elements of foreign policy regarding Ukraine. That will lead to a rise in the threat level to the national security of our country. At the same time, the Russian strategic goal for Ukraine will not change. In the short term, Russia will not compromise on Ukraine in terms of reintegration of the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukrainian success in this effort will provide a success of our country's government and enhance its efforts on the Crimean issue. This will pose a great impact on Putin's regime in Russia and on the pro-Russian forces in Ukraine. To date, Russia has several instruments for hybrid warfare against Ukraine. The most effective tools are special operations, military operations, and diplomacy. The Kremlin will not only manipulate with controlled escalation on the contact line, but will also increase the number of provocations within our country by use of agents of influence. In such a way, Moscow attempts to undermine the Ukrainian government's political achievements. Foremost, introduction of a ceasefire regime within the Joint Operation Forces area. Under the above-mentioned circumstances, the Kremlin is expected to provoke escalation in the east of Ukraine by the increased use of heavy armaments for shelling of Ukrainian armed forces positions and villages in the Ukrainian-controlled area to provoke Kyiv's response actions. Provoking a high-impact incident on the occupied territories, shelling of kindergartens, schools, hospitals, factories, etc. Russian occupation forces command conducts measures on maintaining and training the mobilization of reserves, as well as the 1st and 2nd Army Corps units. At the same time, Russian armed forces have started combat exercises of Russian battalion tactical groups located near the Ukrainian border. Following the decision of the Ukrainian military command to prioritize combat exercises for 2021 on the topic of offensive operations conducted in high urbanized areas. Russian Armed Forces Command has increased the number of inspections of its troops on the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk. Apart from that, it has increased activities on the readiness of protection elements for the two-corps system within the framework of the military district, Russian occupation forces 1st and 2nd Army Corps. Also, Russia has started informational operations to blame the Ukrainian government on reintegration of its territories by use of military force to cover its preparation for combat actions in East Ukraine. Russia is expected to repeat its allegations concerning Minsk Agreement violations and the breakdown of the ceasefire on the international level. Besides that, sabotage actions on military infrastructure, armament and storage, etc., are likely to occur in order to decrease defense capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces and to cause pretext for public criticism of the Ukrainian government. Weakening Ukrainian government positions, Russia will provoke our country's population to participate in mass anti-government protests, mainly by the use of agents of influence. The aggravation of political, ideological, and social economic confrontation between different groups of Ukrainian society will be a focal point. We suggest conducting meetings with representatives of foreign partners of Ukraine for information exchange and joint action to counter hostile Russian policy. Considering the positive experience of cooperation between partners in 2020, we kindly suggest the increase of number of and scale of common combat exercises on the territory of Ukraine with military force presence demonstration as an element of strategic deterrence of Russia. Current threats to Ukraine's national security. Assessment of the security environment in the world and around Ukraine reflects maintenance of existing and emergence of new threats and challenges to Ukraine in a midterm perspective. Russia will continue to be the main source of military danger for Ukraine, with a permanent increase of the threat level. Russia will try with hybrid methods, at a minimum, to prevent Ukraine from its Euro-Atlantic integration and to weaken our country's economic and political potential, and at a maximum, to bring pro-Russian politicians into power and gain overall control of Ukraine. During the next 5 years, Russian Federation is going to attain capabilities for aggression against Ukraine with assets from the Western and Southern military districts without any additional reinforcement. The most dangerous threats to Ukraine's national security in the military sphere remain the following. 1, armed Russian aggression against Ukraine and the militarization of temporary occupied territories. 2, increasing of strike potential of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. Increase in scale and number of offensive Russian military exercises in the Ukrainian direction. 3, intelligence and subversive activity of Russian special services intended to undermine the social and political situation, support of illegal armed formations and separatism in the eastern regions of Ukraine, and to set up conditions for armed aggression projection. Besides that, real and potential threats to Ukraine's national security in other spheres. Blockade of Ukrainian economic activity and seizure of its civil and military objects in the Black and Azov Seas by Russian Federation with use of military force. Ukrainian anti-Russian informational operations aim to discredit Ukraine's foreign policy, to weaken international support, promotion of pro-Russian content in the Ukrainian informational sphere, strengthening the military union between Russia and Belarus, and the Russian military presence in Transnistria. Russia holds the ability to exploit Belarusian and Moldovan territories and resources against Ukraine. General deterioration of the international security system, deterioration of effective mitigation of international institutions in terms of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. And finally, reduction of international control over development, production, and storage of nuclear armaments and its delivery systems. Denunciation of the system of treaties on conventional armed forces in Europe, with further violation of the existing international framework for security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mick. That was well done and well read, and we have to, and I know how much work you did to be able to get this from Mr. Moshevets under the difficult circumstances that he found himself. So I'm really appreciative of it. I'm glad that you gave us the screen. What I would now do is we now transition to the second day fully, and what I would just simply do is get it over to Ambassador Bill Courtney. I just simply want to say that the difference between yesterday and today might seem to be that we were dealing in a hybrid conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We were dealing with hard power yesterday, because both external aggression and internal subversion lead to outright violence and so on. But no more dangerous, and perhaps even ultimately socially lethal, societally lethal, is soft power and the issues that we're dealing with today. The issues of undermining a country's economic security and energy security, or for that matter, using disinform and cyber operations against it. And so today we will have two very, very important panels. And I'm just delighted because in the same way as we had 4 aces in each panel yesterday, it looks like we're going to have 4 aces in each panel today. And so with that, I will turn it over to one of those veteran diplomats that we've talked about yesterday, the Taylors and the Freeds, the John Herbst. There's another individual like that. His name is Ambassador Bill Courtney. With the deepest respect to him, he's been with us through all these things in the last 20 years. We've done these conferences, and I really appreciate that he's taken so much time with us. Bill, Ambassador Courtney, it's all yours.
Walter, thanks very much. It really is an honor to continue to participate in these conferences, which are really extremely informative and educational. So our panel deals with economic and energy security. And I will set the stage for our discussion by summarizing current US efforts to improve Ukraine's economic and energy security. But I will leave to our 3 really quite eloquent speakers to talk about some of the more controversial policy issues, including Nord Stream 2. First, let me summarize US bilateral assistance to Ukraine. With USAID support, the government of Ukraine recently achieved several milestones. They include introducing electronic disclosure and reporting for publicly listed companies, facilitating transparent and efficient asset trading, and developing a bond market. In the financial sector, current US aid programs seek to increase public confidence in the banking system, support the financial sector's legal and regulatory environment transformation, and increase access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. These are all worthy goals. The Western NIS Enterprise Fund focuses on developing economic leadership and local economies and building social investments and export promotion. USAID programs help startups and SMEs become more competitive in domestic and international markets. USAID supports entrepreneurs and SMEs to mitigate the adverse impacts of the Donbass conflict and reduce the region's reliance on oligarch-backed big business and trade with Russia. USAID is promoting the development of a competitive business environment, primarily by providing advisors to the Anti-Monopoly Committee. USAID supports the reform and privatization of state-owned enterprises and reforms in the real estate sector. And those are areas of enormous importance and higher priority than in the past. USAID is helping Ukraine strengthen the resilience of its critical infrastructure to cyber attacks. USAID programs bolster energy security by helping Ukraine improve the legal and regulatory environment and increase the resilience of energy supply. USAID helps Ukraine increase the transparency of energy data and empower public watchdogs, and these reduce corruption risks. Finally, USAID helps improve electricity and natural gas regulation to encourage greater competition and transparency. Now let's turn to US support of multilateral efforts. And these are primarily by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD. Last June, the IMF approved an 18-month, $5 billion standby arrangement for Ukraine. But the IMF conditioned disbursements of this fund on Ukraine's ensuring central bank independence and a flexible exchange rate, recovering funds from bank resolutions such as Privatbank, and improving governance and anti-corruption measures. Last month, an IMF review concluded that all these conditions had not been met, and so no new tranche has been approved. World Bank investment in Ukraine focuses on improving public services such as district heating, water and sanitation, health, social protection, and infrastructure such as electric power networks and national roads. The EBRD supports Ukraine's economic stabilization and reforms. It helps Ukraine strengthen energy efficiency, boost agricultural and industrial potential, improve infrastructure, and bolster the financial sector. As administrator of the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, the EBRD is helping to transform the site of the 1986 accident. The US supports all these multilateral activities, including the IMF's much discussed tough love approach. Now our three speakers will address major issues and controversies related to economy and energy security. And you have the bios in the program, but let me just very briefly introduce them. Mikhailo Honchar is president of the Center for Global Studies, Strategies 21. Earlier, he served for many years as director of energy programs at the NOMOS Center, and he helped found Kiev's prestigious energy club, Q. Anders Aslund is resident fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and a professor at Georgetown University. He is a leading American specialist on economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He's the author of a number of books, most recently, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy. Excellent book, by the way, very readable. And our third speaker, our discussant, is Dr. Ariel Cohen, who's a non-resident senior fellow, also at the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, like Anders Aslund is. Dr. Cohen is recognized authority on international security and energy policy, and a leading expert in Russia, Eurasia, and the Middle East. For over 20 years, Dr. Cohen served as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he, like Dr. Aslund, is an author of a number of books. So let me start here, and we'll begin with Mikhailo Honchar.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dear colleagues, friends, it's a unique opportunity to meet with you in virtual space. Let me speak about not only US-Ukraine energy cooperation, but energy security issues too. The cooperation with the United States in energy and energy security fields was and will remain particularly important for Ukraine. Thanks to the US-Ukraine cooperation in the nuclear power sector, Ukrainian nuclear power plants have significantly decreased dependence on thwart, a former monopoly supplier of nuclear fuels from Russia. It should be noted in this respect that Ukraine is ahead of many countries in Central Eastern Europe, which are EU member states, which remain dependent on nuclear fuel supplies from Russia. However, there is another problem in the nuclear power sector, and not only for Ukraine, but for the region of Eastern Europe as a whole. There's a Belarusian nuclear power plant, new build. Preventing operation of the Belarusian nuclear power plant built by Rosatom without taking into account international conventions is becoming a very important issue for Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland. This nuclear power plant poses risks to the countries of the region and will become a springboard for Russia's energy expansion. Lithuania has already appealed in 2020 to the former US administration, asking for support of efforts aimed to stop the commissioning of this nuclear power plant. Ukraine has not forgotten how important the efforts of the US Vice President Joe Biden were by accelerating the launch of additional reverse gas supplies to Ukraine from the EU countries in the critical period of 2014-2015, when Russia waged a gas blockade of Ukraine during the armed invasion into Donbass. It was very important for us in that time. Experimental deliveries of liquefied natural gas from the United States to Ukraine proved to be successful from a technical and organizational point of view. Initially, in 2019, it was done through the Polish LNG terminal Świnoujście in the Baltic Sea, and in 2020 through the Greek LNG terminal Revitusa in Aegean Sea, and the reverse flow through the Trans-Balkan gas pipeline. The US efforts to promote the oligarchization of the Ukrainian economy, energy, and finance spheres are of utmost importance. In particular, we are talking about Kolomoisky and Firtash becoming subject of special investigation in the United States. The US Congress's sanctions against the anti-Ukrainian, anti-Polish, and anti-European Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project in December 2009 came exactly at that time they were mostly needed, extremely needed. They helped signing of new 5-year contract agreement between Gazprom and Naftogaz, while potentially deterring Russia from accelerating further aggressions. Let me talk more details on this project, which the former vice president and the current president of the United States calls a bad deal. It is not just that the launch of Nord Stream 2 will cause economic damage to Ukraine. The fact is that the launch of the project will symbolize the victory of Putin's kleptocracy and Russian corruption over Western democracy, the victory of Russia and Germany together over the United States, the dominance of the Russian-German alliance in Europe, and break of transatlantic unity, from my point of view. Russia's energy relation with Europe, and first of all with Germany, as its greatest lobbyist, a kind of a tracing paper from the Soviet Cold War era methods. I have some slides. Let me show. I prepared several slides. Wait a minute. Yes.
Very good.
Do you see?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It is worth to mention a fragment of secret report of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs named On the Political Line and Some Practical Steps of the USSR, with regards to Willy Brandt government coming to power in Germany, which was submitted to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Soviet Union on December 1st, 1969. Let me quote. You see on your screens. We consider as important to talk about the conclusion of a contract that would be valid for 2 decades and would make, to some extent dependent on the Soviet Union, such an important area of the German economy and energy sector. Retrospectively, after more than 50 years, it can be stated that the task is not only fulfilled, but even surpassed. Not only the energy sector of already united Germany has become dependent, but also its political class, most of which, like drugs addicts, do not recognize this dependence. If Nord Stream 2 succeeds, gas pipelines will bring dividends to the Kremlin kleptocracy and its German partners. According to Russian gas industry sources, the shareholder agreement between the project participants stipulates that the Swiss Nord Stream 2 operator will receive payments for gas transportation services from the moment of its commissioning. I underlined, from the moment of its commissioning, regardless of whether there will be gas in it at all. The number of payments for services will correspond to the maximum design capacity of the gas pipeline, 55 billion cubic meters per year. This explains why Gazprom wants to complete at least one line and to make a formal commissioning ceremony. From now on, more than $1.4 billion annually will flow to the Swiss company of Gazprom for the next 50 years. 50 years. The biggest part of this money will go through the mechanism of paying dividends to the right people. In Europe, it's already the case for the existing Nord Stream project. This is the current Putin's corruption mechanism in Western Europe. Therefore, no one should be surprised why in Germany, Austria, France, Italy, there are so many Putin verstehers. You see the scheme, general scheme on your screens. Nicholas Burns expressed the idea that Washington should temporarily freeze sanctions against Nord Stream 2, and Europe should stop the construction of the pipeline. It might be seen as an acceptable idea. It provides for an option to freeze the project due to the no constructions, no sanctions approach, at least until the election in Germany in the autumn of current year. But the pipeline is not being built by the European Union, but by Russia through the Swiss company, Gazprom's company, Nord Stream 2 Aktiengesellschaft, which is registered in Swiss Canton Zug. And the Russian immediately resumed the construction of the pipeline, thus stimulating a new wave of transatlantic controversy. This is exactly what the Kremlin needs in our situation. The idea of creating a mechanism that would ensure further transit through Ukraine in case of the Nord Stream 2 completion is unacceptable too. The question is, who and how will determine when to stop Nord Stream 2? Which legal and contractual mechanism can be applied? Between whom and who will tighten the gas valve on NS2 pipeline? This idea will not create a safeguard tool. Russia will bypass such an agreement in a very simple way. Suddenly, there will be an accident somewhere in the Russian hinterland. on the route of the gas pipeline, for example, Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhgorod. After which Gazprom will make a statement about the impossibility to use in further and start decommissioning procedure. In such circumstances, Nord Stream 2 becomes the only possible alternative to ensure European energy security. By the way, a similar mechanism has already been used by Russia two times. The first time, it was 2006 in the event of an interruption of oil supplies to Lithuania through the Druzhba first pipeline. Suddenly, there was an accident with an explosion on the section of the oil pipeline near the Belarusian border. Oil supply was stopped immediately. Further investigation, so-called investigation and technical expertise concluded that the pipeline was decrepit and could not be repaired, and that oil could not be supplied to Lithuania. In 2009, the situation was similar with the gas transmission on the Central Asia Center gas pipeline for gas from Turkmenistan to Russia and to Ukraine. As soon as Gazprom became unprofitable to import gas from Turkmenistan, even though they contracted all exports for next 25 years, long-term contract, a sudden explosion occurred. Despite the fact that the functionality of the gas pipeline was restored within 2 weeks, the Russians refused to take from this direction, arguing that the state of the pipeline as a whole was at disrepair. Unfortunately, the European Union is powerless to stop this project. The European Commission only states that the Nord Stream 2 is not supported by the EU, is not a project of common interest within the EU, and is not funded from the budget or EU funds. However, the EU cannot stop this commercial project as it would be discriminatory. The European Commission's stance is that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline should operate in accordance with international law and EU energy legislation. Germany has implemented the amended European Gas Directive into national law, so all responsibility for its application lies with it, and specifically with the German Network Regulatory Office Bundesnetzagentur. The European Commission considers the American sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 as unacceptable actions of the third parties that undermine the position of European business. Thus, it can be concluded that the European Commission has almost washed its hands in the case of NS2. It is worth attention that the European Commission does not raise the issue of the Nord Stream's negative impact for Poland as an EU country member, and Ukraine as a country with an association agreement. The European Commission does not say a word to Russia about the need to ensure freedom of transit gas for gas streams from Central Asia to Ukraine and further to Europe. It will be very interesting for more competition for European market. Europe does not take into account the fact that Russia will use the emergence of Nord Stream 2 to increase its military presence in the Baltic Sea. That is, there will be a kind of legal militarization of the Baltic, because according to the Kremlin's logic, the new 2 lines of the Nord Stream 2 and the existing 2 lines of Nord Stream 1 need enhanced protection against hostile actions by third countries. This is exactly what Russia is doing in the Black Sea, justifying the build-up of its forces by fairy tale threat posed by the US, of course, and NATO to the Blue Stream, Turk Stream, bridge power cables and gas interconnectors across the Kerch Strait to the occupied Crimea. What should we do? Several points. Through joint efforts of the United States, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and our partners in Germany, to stop the Nord Stream 2, interrupt building of this project. Make an effort to block the Belarusian nuclear power plant constructed in violation with ESPO convention and does not correspond to nuclear safety regulations. Complex asymmetrical approach could be used by the United States if Russia continues to support Gazprom in construction of Nord Stream 2 and Belarusian nuclear power plant building and operation. It will mean that other Russian state companies, as some Gazprom Neft and Rosatom, as a contractor for problematic Belarusian nuclear power plant construction, could be placed under sanctions. And if we, in my conclusion remark, now many talks about possible new wave of sanctions against Russia in the context of Navalny case. But not only Navalny in Russia is a one prisoner. More 100 Ukrainians from occupied Crimea are political prisoners, which are in Russian colonies, strict regime colonies, and prisons. Progress of the Nord Stream 2 means more repressions against Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars and Crimean Peninsula. So we must take into consideration that new gas or other energy projects with Russia between European countries, first of all, Germany and Russia, is impossible if Russia continues these repressions, not only in the context of Navalny case. Here are only some positions for Ukraine-US agenda for cooperation that are relevant and need an immediate reaction. But I still don't have an answer to the question whether the Biden administration, new US administration, has this political will. Probably our your American colleagues and friends, you know answer on this question. I hope on the best versions. That's all. Thank you so much for your attention.
Zaryckyj, thank you for good historical discussion as well as analytical discussion of the current situation on Nord Stream 2. This is exactly what we had in mind. And you are right. Anders Aslin and Ariel Cohen have deep insights into policymaking in Washington. And so we will now turn to them. Anders, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. And Walter, as always, it's great to see both of you. And thank you very much for the invitation. I always enjoy participating in these events. I thought that I should discuss 3 points and then come to the conclusion of what this means for US policy on Ukraine now with the new Biden administration. And one part is, where is Ukraine now in terms of the macroeconomic situation? The second is what is happening with economic reforms. And then third, what is it President Zelensky has done in the last month or so in order to improve his standing in the United States, and what does it matter? And then finally coming to the what it means for, likely it means for US policy. If I start with the macroeconomic situation, it's better than it has been for a long time. Russia has not had such large international reserves since 2011, for a decade. That was before Yanukovych started stealing them. And they are now $29 billion. It's 5 months of import. So that is quite reassuring. last year, Ukraine had a decline in GDP of 4%, which is relatively moderate and much better than what had been expected. Largely, this is because of the structure of the Ukrainian economy. There's relatively little of tourism and hospitality and travel business in the Ukrainian GDP. But the Ukrainian COVID policy was, on the whole, considered quite decent. It's another matter with vaccination. And this year, the general forecast is a GDP growth of about 5%, which is close to what is expected in the world in general, slightly less. The big windfall Ukraine had last year was a big current account surplus because of low energy prices on the one hand and high agriculture prices and iron ore prices on the other hand. So normally Ukraine has a current account deficit in its foreign trade of about 3% of GDP. Last year, it was a surplus of 4% of GDP, which is a major explanation for the good development of international reserves. Inflation has risen recently to slightly over 6%. And as we speak today, the National Bank increased the interest rate to 6.5%. This is what it should do since inflation is rising. But that inflation is rising, it's mainly food prices, which are quite important for the Ukrainian inflation. And it's the same in other countries in Eastern Europe. So this is nothing special. So the macro picture is better than it has been for a very long time. Then we come to the question of reforms. Ambassador Courtney discussed that in the beginning what USAID is doing in all these fronts, and it is working on the relevant issues. The problem is that the government is not very interested. The IMF just spent 5 weeks with a mission in December, January, and February to get and came to absolutely no conclusion. And this is a concern. So what are the problems? You can say that it's virtually all the big questions regarding structural reform. It's the anti-corruption framework with the status of NABU, the anti-corruption police, and it's the e-declarations and what happens if you don't fill it out properly. Yesterday, the parliament adopted in the first reading a judicial reform which does not qualify because it means that the old somebody is not Mikhailo, can you? Thank you. And the judicial reform, that as it was proposed now, simply means that the old judges will appoint the new judges and we will not see any substantial improvement. What really broke the negotiations was that during the negotiations, the Ukrainian government imposed a price cap on the gas prices 30% below the market price for households. So that Ukraine has now reintroduced dual pricing on the gas market, which has caused so much corruption previously on the gas market in Ukraine. There's also a problem with corporate governance. The new acting minister of energy, Yuri Vitrenko, wants to abolish the supervisory board of Naftagaz altogether. And last year, the members of the supervisory board were not paid salaries for 6 months because the parliament didn't feel like doing that. right now. The supervisory board of the railroads has been called to the parliament to explain why the company is working so poorly. Well, if you close down the company to a considerable extent because of COVID, you're losing money. So that's a pretty obvious case. And the parliament should not be a party in the corporate governance. So the corporate governance reform seems to be being pretty much destroyed. What has really deterred foreign investors last year was the electricity non-payments, where the different government prices and government organizations don't manage. The Ukrainians complain that the green tariffs are too high. There are lots of foreign investors who have invested in green energy in Ukraine. 11% of electricity now in Ukraine comes from green energy, wind and solar. But the total non-payments are about $1 billion. And this can be solved in many ways, but that requires decisions, and the decisions are not being made. And then I could add, for example, on NBO legislation, the IMF is upset that a decent law on a deposit guarantee fund is not being adopted. So in short, there's no agreement on any point between the IMF and the Ukrainian government. And the question is really raised, do these negotiations make any sense any longer? I'm skeptical myself whether that is sensible, and in any case, complete rethinking is needed. While fiscal policy is not really major concern here. Ukraine last year had a smaller budget deficit, substantially smaller than the IMF had allowed for, while there's discussion on what is being spent on. So what is it President Zelensky has been doing for the last month? He has done a lot of very positive things. After you can say that there has been a reversal of reforms from March last year when he sacked the government under Alexei Honcharuk. And in the last month, President Zelensky has then sanctioned the Chinese company that had bought Motor Sich. So this business is being stopped. What I'm particularly appreciative of is the sanctioning of Viktor Medvedchuk and his companies, and in particular the 3 television companies that he has at least supervised, if not owned. And we've also seen that 3 top managers in the Privat Bank have finally been prosecuted. But these are more matters of execution and not of legislation. So that it seems that the reform legislation has stopped altogether. So then I'm coming to the question, what can we expect the Biden administration to do about this? As was discussed yesterday, the big issue is complete and unconditional US support of Ukraine's sovereignty, which means more military support. We have already seen a decision of $125 million of new money in military support from the US government. And one would expect that the US government will continue to provide military support in the higher level of something like $500 million a year. It's very unclear to me how the Biden administration will act with regard to reform. The standard statement is tough love, to engage as Biden himself did with President Poroshenko. But the question is, who will be Assistant Secretary of State for Europe? We don't know as yet. And who will become US Ambassador to Kiev, who will be very important. We don't know as yet. And I don't think that there is any name. And it's simply unclear how much the US will engage for reforms. And perhaps the Biden administration just says, that, okay, it's obvious that the Zelensky administration and parliament are not interested in reforms. Why should we try to be more reformist than the Ukrainians themselves want to be? And then another, a third unclear question on the US agenda is, will the US engage in organizing a peace in Donbass? And there are serious thoughts about it, but this will be a major decision at the level of the president if he thinks that this is worthwhile. And the natural approach to it would be, as Michael Carpenter and Ambassador Bergeron have suggested, to gradually increase US, or threaten to increase US sanctions on Russia if Russia doesn't move. And that the US would engage whatever the structure of negotiation would be. So this is what I think is the most interesting question. So full military support from the US, unclear whether the US engages in reforms or not, and also unclear whether the US really engages on Donbass. There would be some engagement, considerably more than we have seen from the Trump administration, but how much, I dare not say. Let me just say, comment a little bit on what Mikhailo said about Nord Stream 2. My view basically is that Nord Stream 2 will not be completed. The Russians have now just brought another pipeline ship, Akademik Chersky, there, but as it is with Fortuna, they can lay only 400 meters a day, and it's about 160 kilometers left. So this will take a long time. I think that the Biden administration will first talk to Germany and ask, do you have any solution? And since it takes a long time to lay this remaining pipe, they can take their time to do so. I think that the Greens are likely to do very well in the German elections in September, and the Greens are dead against Nord Stream 2. So if the pipeline has not been completed by then, which I don't think is really physically possible, then I don't think that the pipeline will be built. There's absolutely no commercial need for them. I looked up the numbers. Russian gas exports to Europe, the 27 EU members, peaked at 168 BCM in 2019. This year, it's expected to be 135 BCM, and then it will continue to decline. So Ukraine alone could pipe all this gas to Europe. So Russia has already, as it is, almost twice as much pipeline capacity as it needs. And the purpose of Nord Stream 2 is entirely geopolitical and corrupt. These are the two purposes. There's no commercial motive behind it at all. And it should be considered a corrupt project of Gerhard Schröder and Matthias Warnig, approximately as you said, and therefore it should be stopped. And I hope that the Biden administration comes to that. And if not, the new German government that will probably be formed after the elections in September. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's terrific, Anders. As always, you have the most comprehensive and insightful view of economic situation in Ukraine. Ariel Cohen will offer, he is our lead discussant, will offer perspective, and then we will open it up to general discussion. Ariel?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Vlatko, as always, for inviting me. I think this effort, both politically and intellectually, is extremely important to maintain the profile of Ukraine in this town when we have competing pressures from different priorities that are on the table of the Biden administration. I think Anders raised a very important point, whether the United States is going to get involved in trying to influence Russia to come to a necessary and long delayed solution for Donbass. And I think we will see a competition of pressures. On the one hand, the instincts of Mr. Biden himself and of the top officials in his administration are to help Ukraine and to contain Russia. But the logic of the US focus on China and China becoming the top priority of the US foreign and defense policy for the foreseeable future will dictate to us to try and delegate the responsibility for the borderlands of Europe to Europe. I was privy to some very interesting virtual meetings with the Germans on the fringes of the Munich Security Conference. And I think the American position in these meetings was, this is your chance. You want more autonomy and visibility for Europe, deal with it. And the German position is Nord Stream über alles and Ostpolitik version 3. And we're not going to escalate with Russia. And I think you see a competition between Berlin and Paris to try to come to terms with Mr. Putin. And of course, by the logic of it, Putin will require a price, and the price will be the Donbass and the Crimea. Let's put the geopolitics aside and focus on what I was asked to talk about, energy. I'm not going to comment very much on Anders's presentation and Mikhailo Honchar's presentation. I will also only would like to say that if Anders's prognosis on the victory of the Greens is true, the Greens will be in a coalition, and probably not the biggest party in the coalition, either with the CDU or with the Social Democrats. And both CDU and the Social Democrats demonstrated their commitment to Nord Stream. And I was a Nord Stream skeptic for a long time, meaning I was expecting it to be built more slowly than it's happening, of course. But it's being built, and 160 kilometers of a pipe, when the German commitment is so strong, is not that much. 400 days with one ship, maybe 200 days with two ships. I am not necessarily that optimistic, and the Biden administration has shown so far that their commitment to sanctions is limited. I mean, they put some sanctions on some Russian senior officials, but I think Russia is in the position where they don't care. But now let's go and look at what I really was invited to talk about, which is Ukrainian Ukrainian energy situation. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say the energy sector in Ukraine overall, with some exceptions I'm going to mention, is not in good shape. I talk to people in Ukraine who are in the industry, and they tell me that the shutting down of the nuclear reactors for maintenance generated deficit of energy that Ukraine tried to fill by burning coal, and now the coal supplies are going down. The ideas of buying electricity from the Belarus nuclear reactor or Russian coal, the ideas that, to me, undermine the Ukrainian claim to sovereignty and are absurd during the current conflict with Russia. These are political decisions, and let's face it, these are business decisions as well. But Ukraine, as we all know and talked about this in this forum many times, has the resources to be energy independent, be it gas, be it nuclear, be it coal in the areas that are currently not controlled by the Russians, although 100 out of 148 coal mines, 95 are controlled by the Donbass separatists and the Russians de facto. And it's not a bad deal for the Russians if their oligarchs can sell coal to Ukraine and make money on that. So what is the challenge? The challenge is to continue the reform of the Ukrainian energy sector, to keep the current renewables on track, because Ukraine buys a lot of goodwill with the Europeans by developing its renewable sector. Ukraine also is thinking at this point about developing a very important future energy industry, hydrogen, be it as the transit country, and yeah, it will be a transit from Russia as the Russian gas industry evolves towards hydrogen. The Ukrainian system is large, but it's obsolescent. It's old. It requires a lot of maintenance. The challenge is how you repurpose or adjust some of the pipelines to pump hydrogen or generate hydrogen in Ukraine. But then again, this question is hydrogen for what? Is it hydrogen using the renewable so-called green hydrogen, subjecting water to electrolysis and using solar and wind to break the water? It's not an economically viable process at this point, but we've seen, for example, with batteries, with renewable energy, the prices are going down by tens of percents over a relatively short period of time. So the question for the economist is, the green hydrogen going to be viable anytime soon? And secondly, the blue hydrogen from gas, and also other types of hydrogen that are more polluting. Furthermore, the economic side of energy remains not fully reformed. The government came up with a pretty decent program to continue the energy sector reform. And the goals sound very good, arranging secure supply of electricity and natural gas to consumers, integrating energy markets into European markets. By the way, the grid of Ukraine that was on the Soviet frequency and the European grid on a different frequency, they are not married yet. And the purpose is to link the Ukrainian grid with the European grid. It is an important goal that will increase Ukrainian energy security and will further integrate it to Europe. To continue the government priorities, improving the performance and reliability of Ukrainian unified energy system. I did some consulting work not too long ago looking at the grid. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the differential between the interruptions in the Ukrainian grid versus Poland, Slovakia, and then further west, Germany and Holland, is by orders of magnitude. The Ukrainian energy system is extremely insufficient. The industry uses at least twice as much energy per $1,000 of production than Slovakia, and probably close to, I'm going to say, 100 times, maybe okay, by orders of magnitude, more energy than Germany. And at the same time, the interruptions are much, much higher. So it's inherently insufficient system that needs capital investment to reform it and to upgrade it. Without this investment, nothing is going to happen. Further, the government is talking about increasing the production of Ukrainian energy materials where economically feasible. This raises a question about the cost of production for renewables, developing renewables, low carbon energy sources, and alternative fuels, increasing energy efficiency across the production consumption chains, and reforming the coal industry. Well, it's all very good. The goals of this to ensure the proper functioning of energy markets, to ensure continuous energy supply. I mentioned the coal industry already, and to improve energy efficiency. But if you continue to mismanage each individual industry, if your nuclear is in many cases at the end of the life cycle and there's no money to invest to renew or to build new reactors as may be necessary, if your coal mines are exhausted or you are in the process of phasing out because of the emissions, if your process of licensing exploration and production is not necessarily straightforward, you will get the results that you're getting. And in terms of cooperation with the US, just sort of out of the left field, let me float an idea here. The United States is desperately needing a nuclear renaissance. Currently, we're building only one nuclear reactor, and the nuclear sector that we have, which is much smaller than Ukraine, 20% of our production, is getting old. We need opportunities for US companies to build reactors. Why not examine an opportunity for American companies to go to Ukraine and start building reactors there that Ukraine desperately needs? And the current change of the financing for US exports now includes financing nuclear reactors abroad. So this is an interesting opportunity that opens tremendous cooperation between American nuclear companies and Ukrainian operators and nuclear companies as well. If the US is not a good opportunity, there are two countries that are building reactors, France and South Korea. I do not expect Ukraine to go to Russia, to Rosatom, and I think the US will have a cow if Ukraine goes to China, although China is now trying to muscle itself into the nuclear reactor sector and compete directly with Rosatom and offer the financing packages of the kind the Russians are offering. And we just saw the Russians are opening with great fanfare. It's Akkuyu nuclear reactor in Turkey, with Putin and Erdogan participating remotely and the head of Gazprom being on the ground. So the challenges are numerous, balancing the price formation, finding finance to revitalize the nuclear industry, opening the gas sector for foreign investors, for exploration and production, and trying to stop diplomatically Nord Stream. I think these are not insurmountable goals. This can be done. What needs to be demonstrated by the Ukrainian side is leadership, transparency, keeping corruption at bay as much as possible, and the vision for the future for integration with Europe, both for linking the grids and developing renewables and hydrogen. I'll stop here.
Ariel, thank you very much. Very impressive specificity about the energy sector in Ukraine. That's very informative. We have 13 minutes left for Q&A. So let me encourage folks to write down their questions in Q&A and send them to everybody. We have one to start out with, and this is from Lieutenant Colonel Michael Hrissack, who U.S. Army retired. This is for Dr. Aslant. He asked about your phrase, full military support. 150 million of the security assistance is withheld until defense reform is implemented. Without legislative action in Ukraine, how can this be implemented? Anders?
I think you can answer that better than I can, Bill. I'm not up on the details on this, but the basic idea is that the US is providing the strong military support. I'm not quite sure on the conditionality on it. Sorry, need on the question, but I suspect you have the answer.
Okay, so don't really have the answer. But instinct in Washington is that generally reform in Ukraine tends often not to happen until there's some pressure from IMF or other places. So this unfortunate situation exists. But in the defense sector, though, the United States and NATO allies have provided an enormous amount of training and equipping support, and of course, lethal weapons in the case of the US. And there are issues now about lethal weapons with regard to naval capability with the Mark 6 patrol boat. And the US has some good lethal weapons in that area. Okay, with no other questions so far?
Ambassador, can I just add to that?
Yes.
For clarification, maybe if I add the clarification, what our dear friend Lieutenant Colonel Hrissack from the Ukrainian American Veterans was mentioning was in the press release about the Defense Department announcing 125 million for Ukraine. It was mentioned that the remaining 150 million in fiscal 2021 appropriated by Congress will only be provided when the Defense Department, in coordination with the Department of State, certifies that Ukraine has made sufficient progress on key defense reforms this year as required by the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's what he was referring to, if that helps in any way.
Yes, no, so in some sense, this is a parallel to IMF activities.
Bill, if I may.
Yes, Anders.
I forgot to mention something, and that is in this new interim national security strategy that was issued yesterday. I think it's 27 pages. Ukraine is not mentioned. China is mentioned 15 times, Russia 5 times. The whole discussion is about democracy standing against the authoritarian states. So this is the dividing line now, but none of the post-Soviet states are mentioned, while Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Tibet are mentioned with regard to China. So one gets sanctions are not mentioned. Of course, Nord Stream 2 is not mentioned. So one gets the sense that the administration has really not thought through what kind of a policy it has towards this area. I was also interested to see that United Kingdom was mentioned once. So the general discussion is about Europe as Europe or the European Union and not going into specific countries, while Russia is clearly defined as a destabilizing adversary and painted in a much worse light than China is, not surprisingly. Thank you. Just to add that.
Yes. So with regard to statements by President Biden and Secretary Blinken, most of them relating to Russia so far have really been about human rights and democracy issues, with the one exception about extending the New START strategic arms reduction treaty. So in contrast to the Trump administration, human rights and democratic issues seem to be a significantly higher priority, and probably, if you just look by what's being said, maybe a higher priority also than in the Obama administration.
I would like to add that I think it's a bit too early to really make a judgment of how the Biden administration policy will look like, because a number of people are not appointed yet. One of the colleagues mentioned the Assistant Secretary for Europe, which is an important position, especially in terms of implementation, not just policy formulation. I think Tony Blinken has a lot of experience to give the marching orders administration of the State Department wants. Mr. Sullivan and the president himself were working these beats for a long time. But on other regions that I'm tracking, the Middle East, key positions are not filled yet. So let's give it, I would say, good 6 months before we get a clear picture. And let's not forget that this is a synthetic process in which Congress is playing an important role. We have a trifecta. We have both the House and the Senate in the hands of the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party has a very strong position vis-a-vis Russia and on Ukraine, and we should expect, it won't get better than this. Let me put it this way. If Congress House flips in 2022 or in 2024, there is a Republican president, it's not going to be better than the Biden administration vis-a-vis Ukraine. And that also means that the Ukrainian expat, Ukrainian diaspora and pro-Ukrainian communities need to understand that this is the 2 years of the window of opportunity to try to push as hard as we can.
I agree.
Yes, I would also point out that in the through the Trump administration, so much more of the policy toward the former Soviet space was really taken over by Congress and, if you will, by the national security establishment, whether that was, Pompeo and State Department, Mattis, and the Defense Department. So the continuity in U.S. policy toward the former Soviet space is really actually quite strong. The only unexpected development was that Trump administration, despite Trump's desire to be friendly with Putin, he allowed for javelins to go ahead to Ukraine and Georgia. But otherwise, it was pretty much a bipartisan policy that has really continued for a long time and is likely to continue even if Republicans take the Senate or the House in the midterm elections. Okay, so no other questions. Walter, I think we can give you back 6 minutes.
I didn't want to intervene, but I do have a question.
Sure.
Maybe I can pose a question. I'm delighted that we're keeping on time because Senator Cardin has made it clear that he's got an iron barrier there. Question is to all of you, including Ambassador Courtney, the Chinese issue. We're talking about economic security and energy security. Perhaps not in energy yet, but China and the Silk Road initiatives and so on and so forth, certainly they're going past the Black Sea. What about the China and Chinese influence in Ukraine? And this is to every one of you. All of you are experts. Let's go to panel. I guess the questions aren't there because you've really answered all the questions. But on the Chinese question, can you address that within the next 5 minutes, let's say?
Sure. Let me give it a shot. In these conversations with the Germans that I mentioned before, around the Munich Security Conference, it's the Marshall Center group that does US-German strategy that I'm a part of, called the Loiser Group. The German colleagues were adamant, more adamant than before, that they want to preserve a good business relationship with China, that they will not compromise their business interest because the United States has an agenda with China in the Pacific to save Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, or because of the geopolitical considerations that involve US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific, India, Japan, Australia, and others. So to the extent Ukraine is seeing its future in Europe, but at the same time is supported by the United States, I think Kiev will have to balance its interests vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis China. China is interested in investing everywhere, including in Ukraine, but also the Chinese presence in Ukraine may be an interesting counterbalance to Russia. I need to dig more on that. I didn't have an opportunity, but it stands to reason that serious Chinese investment will help to keep Russia at bay. And finally, on Motor Sich, I thought the US was asleep at the switch by allowing the Chinese to get as far as they got. I think we needed to prevent the Ukrainian government to sign any kind of agreements with the Chinese on Motor Sich. Unfortunately, it did not happen. And now we are sort of in a potential conflict with Kiev because of that particular issue. I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Chinese did not manage to buy Motor Sich entirely. Is that correct?
Well, let me continue on this. China is now the dominant trade partner of Ukraine. So it has about 15% of Ukraine's trade, and it's twice as much approximately as Russia's trade with Ukraine. And what Ukraine exports to China most of all is food, corn, and other grains, but it's also exporting iron ore on a big scale, since Ukraine now produces more iron ore than steel. And this Motor Sich issue is very serious for the Chinese. This was a private company, and this company is now suing Ukraine in international arbitrage for $3.5 billion. So this will be can become very expensive. Zelensky also sanctioned a few other Chinese companies at the instigation of the US. I do not know exactly how it happened, but Zelensky now considers that he has done a big service to the US, and he wonders where is the phone call from President Biden that he has not received as yet, which seems to be his top priority right now, and he preferred to do it on the security side rather than the other. So you can see from Andrei Yermak's big interview in Kiev Post, which is the easiest outreach to the West, or President Zelensky's interview with Axios, where previously Tony Blinken's wife was the editor-in-chief, that he is trying to get in with the Biden administration as much as possible. And I think it's very desirable that the US can provide a positive response, because otherwise we will have quite a negative reaction from the Zelensky presidential office.
Mikhailo, you have the last word, and hopefully it is a short word.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, first of all, Chinese influence is not counterbalance for Russian influence, unfortunately. And events around Crimean occupation confirmed it. Maybe you know that two biggest, very multi-promised projects, which were initiated by China in that time during Yanukovych period, must be located in Crimea Peninsula. And the Russian occupation interrupted these two projects. And China, no reaction from China in this context. And if you take consideration how Chinese behavior in the United Nations, we see strong, not so strong support for Russia. but without any support for Ukraine. And last point concerning prospects of revitalization of our nuclear energy. Yes, Ariel was right. We have interesting plans together with our American colleagues, but not concerning big nuclear power units, reactors, but small module reactors by Holtec company. So yes, we have some prospects.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's thank our three outstanding panelists. Really terrific.
Absolutely. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Courtney. Thank you, yes, to all three of our presenters. Just an absolutely wonderful job. As
Always
expected.
a pleasure.
And thank you with us again. And please come again, as they say.
Thank you, Walter and Bill.
Thank you. Okay, so Andrew, are we ready for our next? Do we have the next panel ready?
Yeah, waiting for the ambassador to ease on. If you can turn, yes, we're coming on here.
Right.
There's Ambassador Popadyuk. We see Katya, and we have Ostap still coming on as well.
So I will very quickly just read that and introduce, take my minute to introduce. The theme is how might the new administration aid Ukraine in combating disinformation and providing cybersecurity. Again, as I said, as lethal in terms of overall societal projection of power as any of the harder power issues. Both, you've heard it in terms of economic and energy security, the notion of combating disinformation and providing for cybersecurity is absolutely important for us. And to lead that panel, I will introduce someone who, again, if I said that America has a bevy of great veteran diplomats, another one of those great American diplomats, someone who was the first ambassador to Ukraine from the United States, and it seems so long ago, is Ambassador Roman Popadyuk. And I think for this particular topic, I think he's the one that truly can lead this. He's very good in terms of discussion as a discussion leader. So I give it to your able hands, Ambassador Popadyuk, and please go forward, knowing that there is a hard barrier at 12:30 because we've got Senator Cardin on the other end. Okay.
I fully understand. Walter, thank you very much for those kind words and the introduction to the panel. Before I start, I'd like to congratulate you once again on a very successful conference thus far. As usual, you hit the nail on the head in terms of the themes, the discussants, the moderators, and all the panelists that need to be involved in these various topics, ranging from security in Ukraine to economics to now this information panel that we're going to have. You rightly state, right now we're going to be looking at this information. I'd like to just give a few comments. First of all, you know, we all know about the Russian aggression against Ukraine in terms of the outright aggression, in terms of the proxy war that has been waged. But going on very much in the foreground is the disinformation campaign that has been ongoing against Ukraine over the past few years. And this disinformation campaign has progressed on a number of levels. It's been aimed at separating Ukraine from its Western allies. It's been aimed at sowing discord among the Ukrainian peoples themselves. And it's also been aimed by the Russians to undermine the very institutions in Ukraine, governmental as well as non-governmental, in order to lead the people to have a lack of faith in those institutions. This tripod of efforts by the Russians is aimed at undermining the stability of the country, making it a weak state, and thereby making it a state that will become complicit, not complicit, but be more pliant to Russian demands, etc. So it's very important for the West and the United States in particular to undertake a strong stand against this. But, in terms of disinformation, we talk about disinformation in terms of publications, digital, et cetera. There's also a strong undercurrent of cyber threats against Ukraine. We've seen this in terms of the threats against its energy grid over the past few years. But right now, there's a lot of cyber threats going against Ukraine in terms of its institutions as well, to weaken those institutions along the lines that I mentioned in terms of disinformation. I think the Ukrainian government itself has mentioned that, I think in the year 2020, about over 1 million attempts at cyber threats against the various institutions as well as individuals in Ukraine has taken place. And a vast majority of those have been aimed against the government itself, government institutions. The U.S. Embassy itself has spoken out about this growing threat in terms of disinformation and the cyber threats against Ukraine. So it's very much in the upper minds of the U.S. government officials. I think it's very important not only for the United States to be involved in this, but let me tell you why it needs to be involved. First of all, we need to protect the integrity of Ukraine, its stability, etc. We also are experiencing various cyber threats, disinformation threats from Russia itself. So for the safety of our own institutions and our own populace, it's important for us to be very actively engaged and follow this issue. And at the same time, I think it's very important to cooperate with the Ukrainians on this system against cyber threats and against disinformation. Now, to examine these policies, we have three leading experts, as I would say, Walter, in this area. First of all, we have Ostap Krivdik from Ukraine. Ostap, it's good to see you again. It's been a few years, I think. Is Ostap on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Glad to see you, Ambassador.
Okay, it's good to hear your voice. It's been a few years since we've spoken, so it's great that you're involved in this. Ostap is currently the director of the Ukraine in the World program at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He's been an activist and organizer during the Orange Revolution, as well as during the Revolution of Dignity. He also served as a foreign policy advisor to Andriy Parubiy when Andriy was Secretary to National Defense and Security Council of Ukraine, as well as when he was served as head of Ukraine's parliament, Speaker of Parliament. Joining him on this panel is Paul Goebel. Paul, it's good, nice to see you again. It's been a few years since we've spoken. Right. Paul is a leading authority on ethnic and religious issues in Eurasia. He's written extensively and continues to write extensively on these two topics. He's a veteran of various government agencies in the U.S., most particularly the State Department. And he's been decorated by the Baltic states for his efforts on behalf of supporting the independence of those states. So, Paul, welcome. And our discussant for today is Katerina Sedova. Katerina is a research fellow from Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. She's also aligned with the Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. She's a leading expert on disinformation, and she's served as an advisor to members on the Hill, as well as to the Department of State and the Department of Defense. Our panelists, key panelists are Paul and Ostap. They'll have 20 minutes apiece to present their views on the topic. And then we'll turn to Katerina, who will serve as discussant and kind of wrap it up and shed some other light on the various issues that Paul and Ostap will be discussing. We hope to have a few minutes at the end to have questions, Walter. So without further ado, maybe we can start off with you, Ostap, if it's okay, to lead off this panel discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. I will be speaking on two separate issues, on combating disinformation, and I will provide a bit of feedback from people from Ukraine's cybersecurity business sector on the possible ways for the US and Ukraine to cooperate and what can be done better, what can be done more. So firstly, on combating disinformation, what environment are we in? We are in a very tough informational environment. There was a great book published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press. The name of the book is Stand Out of Our Light. The author, James Williams, is, as the person who introduced this book to me said, a recovering engineer. So the person who worked for Google and who switched into the social sciences, learning the impact of the modern technology over psychology, over the perception. So the core issue of this book, which I will strongly recommend for you to read, is that now is the time when the most valuable resource in the world is attention. And the competition for attention is so fierce and strong, and tools that are used are so basic, they're reaching out to such a low layers of our brain that often it is very hard to catch the very moment of manipulation. We are getting dragged into it. The second point I would like to make, it's the time of infodemics. The amount of information flow is so big that many people find it really hard to find proper information. They sink in it and they give up. So this is not only Ukraine's environment. I believe it's a global specific of the informational environment. And here we are coming into Ukraine at war with different cases popping in and out. I would like to speak about two of those specific cases. First being a vaccination case in which actually government is starting to lose the narrative. For the Indian vaccine or surrogate vaccine, as it's called, government is attacked both from opposition and from the Russian side. Multiple myths are circulating, say that this vaccine is from devil. This vaccine is deliberately created by Bill Gates and Soros to for women and men to lose fertility. This is their way to control the population of Earth. And due to the environment, people buy it. And since government previously declared that they are going to communicate directly without the journalists, well, you need the journalists, you need the competent people to be in between, to translate the government's language into the language of the people. And here it is still not the case. Going further into the Russia's activities in Ukraine's media sphere, part of Medvedchuk's media empire was shut down with 3 major channels being turned off, but still a minimum of 4 major channels, amongst them 1+1, where Medvedchuk has a stake, are still on air, and another major TV channel called Inter is gossiped to have been bought from Firtash, who is awaiting trial and extradition. So if we turn into the new media, here situation looks also quite tricky. There was a great analysis by the Center of Content Analysis, which is a Ukraine's think tank concentrated on analytics of the new media in Ukraine. So to cut the story short, Russia wins YouTube, Russia dominates Telegram, and Russia completely controls TikTok. So TikTok is the youngest audience, and Russia simply has close to 100% of presence there. There is some Zelensky's presence in Facebook and visibility in YouTube, and opposition narrative is very strong in Twitter, and some presence in YouTube and Facebook, and they're losing it in Telegram, and they don't exist in TikTok. And if we speak about quantity, this is interesting because it was measured during the so-called crisis of the Constitutional Court, which took place not long ago. So Russian narrative messages within a month that were measured were 5.7 million points of narrative usage, say messages, pictures, videos, etc. And both Zelensky and Ukraine's opposition generated approximately 2 million messages. If we look into the video bloggers, the most popular video blogger of Ukraine is Mr. Zaryckyj, who is clearly recognized as a pro-Russian or actually Russian proxy. But it's not only his political presence which brought him more than 2% of support in elections. It is also his presence actually as Ukrainian foreign presence in media. Zaryckyj is being watched by people from Russia, from Kazakhstan, Russian speakers from Baltics, from Russian-speaking diaspora in Germany, in US, in Canada. So pro-Ukrainian narrative is losing new media. This is risky. And shortly getting back to the oligarchic media, they are actually to be considered the PR departments of the oligarchic business, where entertainment brings the audience and the news let the support or attack on the ruling politicians or some opposition elites. And that's the way oligarchs trade the support for some decisions of the government that enable their business to run. And with 1+1, we've seen the geopolitical impacts of that when 1+1 ran a story of the secret American laboratories producing biological weapons on the Ukrainian soil. Interestingly, there were similar reports in the Georgian media belonging to the sphere of influence of Georgian oligarch Ivanishvili. So let me just quickly point out to another interesting field of fight in the dimension of hybrid warfare, which is, I would name it a historical warfare. You must have heard of the major project in Babyn Yar, which is funded by the Russian money. 3 Russian oligarchs, Aven, Friedman, and Fuchs, belonging to Alpha Group, actually joined their forces. And we know that in Russia, oligarchs are only those who are directly cooperating and enabling Kremlin in its policy. Opposition oligarchs like Khodorkovsky pay their price and get deprived of the property. And so those 3 gentlemen are funding a major project on memory, on history in Ukraine, which might bear very tough consequences. We know what Russia's historical narrative is like and how it is weaponized and how it is used, for instance, against Poland, when Russia is openly excusing partitioning of Poland, openly excusing destruction of Polish statehood in 1939. So here it will be no different, yet it is still happening here. And the impact of such a use of historic warfare might be huge, starting from reaching out to the global Jewish community, ending up with extra pressure on Germany, which is in a way prone to such pressure, as we've seen on comments of President Steinmeier on Nord Stream 2. So how can the United States help within this? Firstly, I think it is essential to recognize Russia-enabled propaganda people within occupied territories as terrorists and shut down their internet presence, shut down their presence in YouTube, shut down their internet presence in Facebook, and make them illegal in the US. This is important also to coordinate this effort with the partners in the European Union and other partners such as Australia, Japan, Canada. So I believe this is important, and there are things that might provide a legitimate ground for that. For instance, recent Russian Donbass doctrine, which was discussed in Donetsk with a heavy presence of Russian propagandists such as Margarita Simonyan. It's actually cultural racism, which is aimed at erasing any Ukrainian cultural footprint at those occupied territories. So I believe there might be a ground to discuss that. Second, I believe America should throw out Russian propagandists and learn from our experience. There was a joke in Ukraine in 2014 when Russian propagandists emerge, expect news happening in 5 minutes. So those people don't make news. Those people are actually enabling the news. And there was a very interesting discussion between politicians of Latvia, Moldova, and Ukraine in 2018, speaking of a very similar pattern of Russians using their media in the NATO country, which is Latvia, and in the countries which are aspiring as Moldova and Ukraine are. So there is a very strong need to legislate against Russian propaganda efforts, not just respond reactively shutting their media outlets down, but legislate on it. An essential thing which would be tricky to do, but it is necessary, and I would strongly point out to Katerina Smagly's important work regarding this. She mapped out Russian sphere of presence in the Western think tanks, including the American ones. There is a necessity to identify and mark those people so they don't pose as independent researchers, but they actually enable Russia's practices. And the fourth, there should be some more informational presence regarding Crimean Platform Initiative and joining them up with Donetsk and Luhansk initiatives. Russia has paid enormous effort to separate those two issues. So Crimea will be kept in the non-recognition corner, and with Donetsk, Luhansk, a dirty trade would be maintained. If we speak about things that the US can help Ukraine inside Ukraine, there is a very interesting concept of the mosquito media fleet. So if we speak about Russian domination in the new media, there is an interesting phenomenon that a single video blogger may have a bigger audience than a TV channel. So here we find a very cost-efficient way to counter Russian propaganda. And I believe ANT's initiative, which is headed by Hanna Hopko, has already been working on this initiative, and probably they will have some suggestions how to implement it. Second, I believe there is a need to increase the presence of Voice of America in Ukraine. Thirdly, it would be good to support Ukraine's independent media, including Suspilne. Fourth, it is necessary to impose tougher sanctions regarding oligarchs connected with Kremlin. We speak of Medvedchuk first and foremost. So 4 more TV channels of Medvedchuk are existing in Ukraine. This should be ended up. And the fifth, an important thing, which is Ukraine lacks a proper technical infrastructure to counter direct Russian and Russia-backed proxy broadcast in areas bordering the occupied territories. So Russians are able to penetrate up to 100 kilometers deep, silencing Ukrainian media and putting the so-called separatist or Russian media instead. This is important to be stopped. I will try some short remarks on cybersecurity within the next 2 to 3 minutes. So here I will quote 2 prominent Ukrainian cybersecurity experts, Konstantin Korsun, who is a CEO of Berezha Security, and Nazar Timoshek, who is a CEO of Under Defense Company. So you can find them on Clutch. They are top 6th and top 9th out of 1,500 small cybersecurity companies globally. They are actually best of the best of Ukraine's cybersecurity experts. They are speaking about the lack of cooperation between the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian private cybersecurity companies, which possess enormous expert potential and which are very good, which are globally competitive in this field. And again, one of their remarks was that there was a problem with, apologies, there was a problem with cooperation with the US side in the cybersecurity for critical infrastructure in Ukraine activity program. That project actually did not return calls for cooperation, and they got their attention concentrated on buying software and hardware only. So there is a lack of communication from the US, and it's a major project with tens of millions of dollars of investment. So here, Ukraine can help the US by several things. Firstly, when Ukraine may create national cyber incident report system, consolidating information on thousands of incidents in both private and public sector. So here you will get an excellent database of Russia's attempts to hack, excellent database of Russia's malicious code, which is used later in different other states, including the United States of America. And here, by unifying methodology with the global one, and with sharing this information with the US, with having this information consolidated and learned at the front line, which is Ukraine. Ukraine actually, they believe, is the hottest space to research current cyber threats. It will directly benefit the United States of America to fight cybercrime and to update their cybersecurity systems. I sum up by saying that Ukraine, in times of hybrid warfare, may be very useful for the United States to see that threats, to have the early detection and to counter them at the very front line, not letting them penetrate any deeper. Thank you, Ambassador, for the opportunity to speak.
Oh, no, thank you very much, Ostap. Thank you for that insightful and very informative presentation. I'm sure a lot of the issues that you raised will be brought up in the question and answer session. With that, I'd like to turn to Paul. Paul, if you could give us your presentation.
Ambassador, thank you. Thank you for including me in this panel. I think it's fair comment that no country on earth has been a greater victim of Russian disinformation and cyber attacks than Ukraine. I think it's important also to recognize that this has a three-faceted reality, and the three facets are not always understood. The first is that Russian disinformation, while it focuses primarily on the domestic audience in Ukraine and on Russian speakers in the first instance and Ukrainian speakers somewhat less, is a broad and kind of Medusa type structure that evolves rapidly and is very, very much more complicated than most of us want to think. And because it keeps changing, people are often fighting the last war in coping with it. Second, I think it's critically important for Ukrainians to understand that the Russian disinformation effort against Ukraine is primarily not about Ukraine as such. That's not the target. The target is other people. That Russia wants to spread messages, spread narratives in Ukraine that will be picked up and transmitted to Western countries and encourage people there to think that Ukraine is a lost cause, that there's not much that can be done. I think we tend to focus only on the impact of Russian disinformation in Ukraine, on Ukraine, rather than on Russian disinformation efforts in Ukraine and their impact on the West. That's been a major problem in Kiev, but it's been an even bigger problem in Western capitals. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we face is moving beyond that. The third way in which Ukraine has been a victim of Russian disinformation is that, unfortunately, there's a widespread view that the best way to counter disinformation, or the two best ways, are either to shut down the sources without a recognition that in the current environment, it's easy to replace them. If you shut down 20 websites tomorrow, you will have 40 websites that will go up. So shutting down, while it has to be part of the process, while identifying people, shaming them has to be part of the process, that's not sufficient. It simply won't be enough, because these people will revive. What has happened again and again is people have tried in various countries, including my own, to shut down Russian disinformation. And the fact is that when they shut down one group of sources, the other sources emerge. So clearly, suppression is not going to be sufficient. The second thing that's not going to be sufficient, and I think this is even more underappreciated in Kiev, is that it's long been held in the West that the response to bad information is more good information. The reason that's a mistake is that disinformation isn't directed primarily about facts. It's about creating attitudes and creating emotional responses that lead people to select what they'll listen to in the future. More good information will easily be rejected by people who've already been affected by disinformation, unless and until an effort is made to explain what's going on to them. If people were simply choosing between good and bad information, most of the time they would choose good information, all other things being equal. But people who engage in disinformation are interested in the first case to make sure that all other things are not equal, that the basis for making judgments is an emotional one rather than a factological one. And therefore, the notion, widespread and certainly part of the tradition I come out of in U.S. international broadcasting, is if we put out good information, that by itself defeats bad information. I wish it were universally true. It's not. It's not true in Ukraine, and that needs to be recognized. And this is something that I wanted to start with. In my remarks, I want to focus very sharply on 9 things. I want to talk about 3 qualities of Russian disinformation, because I think we need to understand just how different it is than the kind of lies that are sometimes emanating from other capitals. Russian disinformation is something that we need to understand as sui generis. It's not a copy, it's not a modification of something else. It's something Russians have been doing for a very long time, and people are unwilling to call them on it. The second trinity I want to focus in is on the 3 targets of that disinformation, because I think we tend, when we talk about disinformation efforts, to confuse those targets. Russia has a very clear understanding, and has certainly since 1917, of what its information audience really is. Because that's so, we often assume we know whom Russian statements are being directed to, when in fact Russian statements are being directed again to somebody else. So we need to be clear about that. And third, I think there are 3 tasks which Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora and friends of Ukraine in the West need to take up that will improve the chances for resisting Russian disinformation, and even more important than that, tighten the relationship between Ukraine and Western countries which are concerned about the free flow of information. Ukraine has not done all that it could to make sure that the West sees it as the front line against Russian activity. And Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainians in other countries and friends of Ukraine have certainly not done all they can to promote that idea within their respective countries and to bring pressure on government officials. There are ways to do that. Some of us are veterans of having done that 40 years ago for Baltic countries and others. But I think we need to do that. I will say very little about cybersecurity. One is I know relatively little about it. And second, I think it's been, OSUP has handled that very, very well. So I will dispense with that part of the panel and leave that to others. But I do want to focus on these 9 things. First, the 3 qualities of Russian disinformation. First and foremost, it needs to be understood that you don't evaluate Russian disinformation in terms of whether it's true or false. Truth and falsehood are not categories that are relevant. Disinformation is about creating moods, it's about creating structures, it's about creating filters that will lead people to make judgments not just about what's being communicated, but about everything. It is effective Russian disinformation gets people to the point that they will reject good information. Not simply that they will accept bad information that Moscow is producing, but that they will choose self-consciously to reject good information because they will see it as having an origin somewhere that shouldn't be trusted and that it should be ignored. That's critical because you have to understand that the success of Russian disinformation is not a single assertion, but it's repetition in multiple formats, in various means, so that it becomes part of the woodwork. It becomes part of the world that people see around them and accept as the new reality. That's not unique to Russian disinformation in Ukraine or to disinformation in general, but it's critically important because the way Moscow succeeds is by getting a large number of Ukrainians not to necessarily accept what Moscow says, but to take an attitude of rejecting what other people say, of evaluating it by an emotional response rather than on the basis of, is this true or not? That whether it is true or not is no longer the important factor for most people. The question is, how do you feel about it? What does it make you feel? If people learn to think that way, learn to feel that way, disinformation can be far more successful than the narrow focus that you usually get. The usual view is if Russia says something that isn't true, and I guess I should confess that I was sort of banned from ever being live again on Voice of America because I once said on VOA Worldwide English after I had said that Vladimir Putin was lying, they asked me how I knew that, and I said he was moving his lips. So I'm afraid I'm someone who believes that they do it pretty much constantly. But the way you counter disinformation is not simply by pointing out that it isn't true. If you focus that way, which is the way most people do, you will miss the point. The Russians expect to be countered that way. And therefore, there are multiple ways of delivering the message, and the fact that they focus on emotion rather than on rationality guarantees that they win that way. If we're fighting the wrong battle, if we're fighting only part of the battle, we will not be ahead. Second point about Russian disinformation is just as Russian intelligence has always planned to fail, unlike Western intelligence, which always plans never to fail, and both get in trouble for that, but the Russian has an advantage. It is also the case that Russian disinformation specialists are constantly aware that they have multiple target audiences, that when they deliver a message in one place, they are making sure that they are delivering it in other places too, so that what is sent to people in the Donbass is also being sent to people in Lviv. It's also being sent to people in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And we tend to respond as if these were completely separate tasks, as if Russians were saying one thing one place, another thing another place, and so on. Some of that happens, but the fact is that the primary audience for Russian disinformation in Ukraine is not about Ukraine for Ukrainians. It's about Ukraine for other countries that will support Kiev or not. It's fundamentally important to understand that the Kremlin's perspective is not that the Ukrainians are resisting Moscow, but that the West is using Ukrainians to resist Moscow. That's a much more important Russian message, and it's much more important to understand and to counter than the specific lies which the Russian propagandists tell. And the third point about Russian propaganda, disinformation, which flows from these two, is to be blunt, blocking it or putting out lists of who's engaging in it. While that may be part of the part of the solution, is never sufficient. The reality is that the ability of Russia to put out, especially in the internet age, ever new spokesman who will deliver whatever messages it wants, means that simply going after them means you will spend a great deal of your resources identifying people, pointing out, this source or that source should be ignored. And while you are doing it, new sources, new channels, new people will go up. I promise you, if you close down 5 media networks in Ukraine that are pro-Russian, you will have 20 new ones within a week after that. And that's part of what makes Russian disinformation effective. It doesn't just simply admit defeat and stop. Closing down Western broadcasts to countries like Ukraine or Poland or somewhere else generally leads Western countries to say, well, we've lost. In the case of the Russians, what you get is we close those down, but that doesn't tell us what we're going to do next because we're going to do more of it. And this has been true again and again and again, not just since 2014, but since 1917. The second point I want to make is about there are 3 targets for Russian disinformation. And the messaging is slightly different, although the basic point is the same. First and foremost, Moscow has to worry about the Russian speakers in Ukraine. Because if it loses them entirely, it is in a position where it will lose Ukraine entirely. It understands that. That has a bunch of consequences. One is that it becomes critically important that Ukraine not do things which make it appear that the Russian language is owned by Moscow. By going after the Russian language itself, what one does is politicize the Russian language. That has the consequence of making it easier for Moscow to engage in disinformation through Russian language channels to Russian-speaking Ukrainians. I realize that goes against the grain, but the fact is, by going so harshly against the Russian language, one has given Moscow certain advantages in this sphere. And in an internet world, closing down the use of Russian doesn't mean very much. That by itself doesn't get you very much. The second and more important next target, which is somewhat more important, is Russian disinformation to Ukrainians. The Russian government has an entire industry devoted to reaching out to ethnic groups. One of the most amazing things, and underreported in the West, is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and people gained access to KGB libraries in Vilnius and elsewhere, what was discovered is that the KGB had prepared special courses on how to recruit this or that ethnic group. It's always struck me as strange that that has not received the attention that it should have. I've written something about it, but others should be doing more as well, because there was an appreciation of how that you had to approach each ethnic group or each religious group or each commercial group in a slightly different way. The Russians are expert at that, and nowhere are they better than in dealing with Ukrainians. Unfortunately, there is a tendency to forget all that and not even to look back at the remarkable book which exists publicly available in Kiev and elsewhere on how to recruit Ukrainians, because that has been a guidepost for how Russian disinformation has been conducted in the Ukrainian language. I think the Russians have been extremely skillful in playing emotional themes. As I say, we need to get away from the specific question of, is this true or is this false? Then what kind of filter does it give people to interpret other things? If by playing on emotional themes, you can get people to reject other people's reporting, which is true, you've gained even more than if you can get them to accept your single report, which is false, because that guarantees that the ability to counter what they're doing will be very, very much diminished. But it is, as I've already suggested, Western publics and governments that are the primary object of Russian concern. It is something that I think the West has totally failed to understand. And that is that Vladimir Putin and his regime do not believe people are capable of doing anything on their own. That ordinary people are simply chess pieces that are played by someone else, the State Department, the CIA, whatever. And therefore, what they do is they're concerned, the task, and this has been true of Russian statements since 2014, is Russia is not fighting Ukrainians in Ukraine. Russia is fighting the United States and the West in Ukraine. And its disinformation is directed in the first instance to make sure that that West turns away from Ukraine, because the Ukrainian people are incapable, in the Kremlin's eyes, of being able to do anything independently. The Kremlin, it should be said, has exactly the same view of its own population. It's incapable of accepting that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That's one of the reasons it will ultimately lose. It is also one of the reasons why so often we misunderstand what's going on. There are then, third point, 3 tasks. First, Ukraine must create a public-private institution that will track Russian disinformation and communicate it very publicly in Ukraine, through Ukrainian embassies abroad, and through the diaspora population. I'd like to suggest a title, and maybe we'll have to increase the number, but 10 Lives of the Week from Moscow for Ukraine. That should be going out every week. And of course, 10 is not nearly enough, but let's keep it so people don't get totally lost. That needs to reach Ukrainians. It needs to be published in the Ukrainian media. It needs to be broadcast by the Ukrainian services of various Western broadcasters. It needs to go to public opinion leaders in every country that has a role in backing Ukraine. It is terribly critical that it do that. That document needs to be put out, first and foremost, in Russian, as well as in Ukrainian, and then in other international languages, English, Spanish, whatever, for speakers elsewhere. Second point is, the diaspora communities need to understand that they must splash this, that they must write letters to the editor, they must write op-eds, so that those things will have an impact on officials in their country who will then support Ukraine. You may not be able to change everything overnight in response to Russian disinformation, but you can change Western attitudes in terms of how much support Ukraine deserves. And third, the West needs to get this weekly report. Ukrainian embassies abroad need to do much more than they are right now in disseminating this. not only because it's important for people to know that Russia is lying so much about Ukraine. Russia is lying so much about almost everything. But rather, the second point, and this is forgotten, Western governments, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, are especially troubled by disinformation to the extent that Ukraine can show itself as a good international citizen on this point. It will gain support simply by doing that. Now, those are my 9 points, but quickly, a related task, Ukraine needs to go on the offensive. Ukrainian propaganda directed at Moscow and at Russians is pathetically weak. And we Ukrainians have every good reason to understand why it needn't be. I've always been impressed by the fact that the Ukrainian communities inside what the borders of what Russians consider their country are called wedges. This is only Klid, for example. They are wedges. Ukraine should be talking to the wedges as well as everyone else, and it should be very public about what it is doing. It hasn't done that, but that will be important because to the extent that you force Russia onto the defensive in those issues, it will have less of an opportunity to continue its disinformation campaign, which, as I've suggested, is far broader than a lot of people allow. Let me conclude with a personal anecdote because it matters to me. It's very easy in these days to think about Ukraine and get depressed. There are so many threats against it. There are so many problems it has that we forget just how much progress has been made. When I was thinking about preparing for this talk today, I remembered that the very first Ukrainian due I attended was at the Illinois University Ukrainian Summer School almost 50 years ago. The first time I spoke to that, after I had spoken, an old Ukrainian from Canada came up to me and said, "Mr. Goebel, I can see you are a friend of my people and my country. 87 times you referred to Ukraine without putting the word the in front of it. Only once did you call it the Ukraine." I've never forgotten that. But I've also never forgotten something else. There was no one at that meeting, and there should be no one now, who wouldn't prefer to have the problems Ukraine has at present and the problems that this conference is, I think, importantly addressing, compared to the question of whether we're going to have the in front of Ukraine, which is what was animating people a half century ago. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. As always, a very cogent and in-depth analysis of the subject at hand. So once again, thank you very much for that. Katerina, let's turn to you. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes to go. So we'd like to leave some time for questions, but Katerina, please feel free to comment on Ostap and Paul's presentations and add your own views.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the organizers for having me in this engaging discussion. At Georgetown CSET, I focus on how emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence will impact international security in general and cyber and disinformation in particular. So I appreciate Ostap's and Paul's insightful research on the latest trends in Ukraine. There are so many facets here to discuss, so many tactics that we probably won't do them justice today, but hopefully this is the beginning of conversation. I will just say that emerging threats like AI have the potential to exacerbate all of these tactics. But the way to think about solutions here is through a lens of building societal resilience. And doing that through a collective response of like-minded nations. And this applies to both countering disinformation and cyber operations. With that, I wanted to talk We've talked a lot about disinformation, and I wanted to open up the aperture a little bit and focus more on the cyber aspects as I've been asked to do. I also would like to reframe the question a little bit, because on the issue of cyber and influence operations, I think of US-Ukraine relations as a mutually beneficial relationship where both sides can learn from each other. Speaking to the Munich Security Conference, President Biden said that addressing Russian recklessness and hacking into computer networks in the United States, across Europe and the world has become critical to protecting our collective security. This statement signals not only that, that there is renewed commitment to partners and allies. It comes as US itself is grappling with a particularly advanced hack known as SolarWinds, which compromised well-defended networks of multiple US government agencies and leading tech firms, undermining trust even in the state-of-the-art cyber defenses. The statement also highlights that the threat of disruptive cyber and disinformation campaigns requires engagement of like-minded nations and industry partners, particularly as malicious actors continue to test both the norms of acceptable behavior in cyberspace and adapt with emerging technology. So to frame my remarks, I'll touch on three areas. First, I'll look at where we have been on this issue in the US-Ukraine context. Secondly, I'll dive into where we are in the bilateral engagement today. And finally, I'll reflect on the opportunities for future engagement. Those of us focusing on Ukraine have been aware of the Russian cyber and influence operations for some time. We witnessed how disinformation can lead to polarization and radicalization and tear societal cohesion. 7 years ago, nearly to the day, armed men lacking insignia fanned out through the Crimean Peninsula. At the same time, threat actors were registering websites related to the Novorossiya project and preparing information operations to inject confusion into local and global information environment. Since then, the word disinformation has firmly re-entered political discourse in the United States too, in the aftermath of 2 election cycles. It is not surprising that late last year, General Nakasone, the head of the United States Cyber Command, called foreign influence operations as the next great disruptor that is likely to continue targeting democratic institutions around elections, attacking diplomatic processes, manifesting in warfare, and sowing civil distrust. On the cyber front, Ukraine has also been on the forefront of experimentation by Russian cyber actors, and their operations escalated in brazenness and disruption. The 2014 attack on Ukrainian presidential elections was an early indicator that threat actors may target election infrastructure, which they did 2 years later in the United States, among other nations. The 2015 and 2016 attacks on the Ukrainian power grid left hundreds of thousands in the dark around winter holidays and sent a chill through the community of cyber defenders tasked with protecting the United States' critical infrastructure. The 2017 NotPetya supply chain attack compromised popular software application and shut down ATMs, businesses, communication and transportation hubs across Ukraine before it tore across global corporations, wreaking $10 billion in damage. There is a robust and nonpartisan recognition in the United States national security community that Ukraine plays a central role as the early target of Russia's most disruptive and most indiscriminate cyber attacks on civilian critical infrastructure. So where are we today? Operations in Ukraine became a clarion call and spurred unprecedented US-Ukraine bilateral engagement on cyber issues. A few months after NotPetya, a US interagency delegation traveled to Ukraine for the first US-Ukraine cyber dialogue, signing the Memorandum of Understanding to establish a partnership specifically on cyber issues. Following the dialogue, Department of State allocated $10 million in cybersecurity assistance for initial assessments. Through the annual NDAA, Congress allocated $250 million to Ukraine assistance, a part of it going to cyber defense and strategic communications capabilities to counter Russian cyber offensive operations and disinformation. For its part, Ukraine has been a steady partner in the US government's efforts to deter Russian aggressive cyber activity by raising costs through indictments and sanctions. Last October, US indicted and imposed sanctions against the individuals within the Russian Military Intelligence Unit, the GRU, for a series of attacks against global targets, including the 2016 US election, the 2017 elections in France, hospitals in the US, and the hacks of the electric grid in Ukraine. Ukraine's security service was pivotal to the investigation that led to this collective action. And of course, as Ostap touched on already, last year, USAID kicked off the Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure in Ukraine project, a $40 million investment over 4 years into building cybersecurity resilience and capacity in Ukraine. This project aimed to address legislative, regulatory, institutional reform to strengthen Ukraine's national cybersecurity policy. It also aims to build technical capacity in the critical infrastructure sectors. It hopes to tackle the shortage of cybersecurity expertise in Ukraine, despite its legendary hacker community. It also aims to spur collaboration between public and private sector stakeholders, grow local cyber market by infusing investment into local cybersecurity companies, and connect them better with industry partners and government. In other words, to help Ukraine build a sustained cybersecurity ecosystem jointly with Ukrainian partners, both in the government and in the private sector. This USAID-backed effort is a unique and ambitious project, and it's trying to do exactly what Ukraine needs: increase deterrence by denial, by closing vulnerabilities and gaps in Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, by making threat actors work harder, help defenders find them faster, and help systems recover seamlessly. So what's next in the relationship, and what are the opportunities to engage? Yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken outlined US foreign policy priorities. He highlighted that partnerships and alliances with like-minded nations on cyber and emerging technology issues, such as AI, will be central to the US approach in order to ensure that the rules of the road of this transformative technology reflect democratic values, not authoritarian ones. First, cybersecurity is a central priority for the administration's domestic and foreign policy. Vice President Harris is signaling that international engagement on cybersecurity and technology will be one of her significant signature issues. The newly established role of the Deputy National Security Advisor for cyber issues will bring coordination to the cyber policy to the White House. Ukraine has an opportunity here to deepen cooperation on cyber issues. This may require a clarity of vision about what Ukrainian government needs and establishment of high-level champion on point within the Ukrainian presidential administration to ensure a unity of effort across business and government stakeholders. Second, the administration should continue support for growing cyber defense and counter-influence operations capabilities of Ukraine's defense sector, including ongoing security assistance. There's also a lot of room here to deepen operational engagement between US and Ukraine cyber forces. Through its Defend Forward doctrine, US Cyber Command aims to disrupt foreign cyber and influence operations in the environments where they originate. As has been reported in the press, Cybercom had already deployed staff to key allies to learn about adversary capabilities. DoD and MOD may want to consider similar engagements and deploy cyber operators from various branches of the US military to Ukraine for exercises and increased information sharing on the forensics, tactics, techniques, and procedures of Russian state actors. And this is exactly the kind of early warning database that Ostap had alluded to as well. Building this early warning system for emerging cyber and influence campaigns can help both nations disrupt malicious operations before they inflict damage. This engagement may also be more possible, particularly if the administration pursues a major non-NATO ally status for Ukraine, as Ambassador Taylor alluded to yesterday. Third, the administration should continue supporting Ukraine's effort to build cyber resilience of its civilian sector. The current USAID-backed project will spend the next 3 years of Biden administration. It aligns well with the administration's priorities. As Ukraine finalizes its national cybersecurity strategy and aligns bureaucratically around it, it can build deeper government-to-government contacts on the civilian cyber defense front between the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and its Ukrainian counterparts. Cybersecurity, much like countering disinformation, is a whole of society effort with multiple stakeholders beyond government responsible for securing their respective parts. CISA has a wealth of experience here, stitching together a network of public and private partnerships through which it communicates threat information to all private sector entities that operate grids, chemical plants, financial organizations, telecoms. It engages the community of white hat hackers, threat intelligence, private sector entities, academic centers. It serves as a cyber risk advisor to other agencies through threat assessments. It also has recently published an international engagement strategy to establish relationships with civilian cyber agencies in like-minded nations. Again, Ukrainian government has an opportunity to deepen this partnership, establish a mechanism for professional exchanges to train agency cadre, share best practices, how to engage with a multi-stakeholder community so it can increase cyber resilience of the private sector networks it doesn't own and harden against cascading effects of devastating cyber attacks on multiple sectors. Finally, and briefly, one of the critical concerns for both nations is the cybersecurity of supply chains. Both nations have experienced severe breaches, though through the so-called supply chain attacks, when a piece of trusted software is compromised and becomes a door into sensitive network. Both NotPetya in Ukraine and SolarWinds in the US were this type of a hack perpetrated by advanced Russian threat actors and difficult to defend against. US cybersecurity ecosystem has done a lot of thinking on this, on how to address these types of attacks, and there are opportunities here for sharing expertise between US and Ukraine through track 1.5 discussion, drawing on government, private sector, threat intelligence, ethical hackers, and academic research labs. Critical part of the supply chain problem is also that modernizing and digitalizing responsibly without opening up new risks to critical infrastructure. And this is where, as Ministry of Digital Transformation undertakes its ambitious digitalization effort, it is vital that speed does not jeopardize security, creating new holes for threat actors to exploit. US and Ukraine can work jointly here to bring ethical hackers from both nations into the process and conduct red teaming and security assessments. Finally, if Ukraine chooses to base its next generation of 5G telecommunications infrastructure on untrusted suppliers from Russia and China, it is likely to make it harder to secure its networks from adversary eavesdropping, especially as collaboration between Russia and China grows, not lessens. The recent decision by the State Service of Special Communications Information Protection to cooperate with Huawei on cybersecurity raises concerns for Ukraine's Western allies, who consider these suppliers untrusted. This is a sticky diplomatic issue, but this kind of, from the cybersecurity perspective, this kind of engagement fundamentally threatens cybersecurity of communication systems in Ukraine and undermines the next generation of telecommunication systems. This also is an area where US and Ukraine cooperate, particularly if additional assistance can offset the cost of choosing secure equipment produced in the like-minded democratic nations over the cheaper solutions with authoritarian strings attached. Let me close with this. US and Ukraine share mutual threats from cyber and disinformation campaigns, and there are ample opportunities for closer cooperation. US is looking to allies and partners to work as a community of like-minded democratic nations in order to address both of the current threats on cybersecurity and those posed by emerging technology. This is an opportunity for Ukraine to clarify where cybersecurity sits on its fairly hefty list of priorities for the bilateral relationship and engage accordingly. With that, over to you, Ambassador.
Okay, Katerina, thank you very much for that overall perspective, particularly in touching on the various issues that pertain to cybersecurity but equally and probably even more importantly, the roadmap that you outlined in terms of tackling some of these issues that the United States and Ukraine jointly can undertake and have been undertaking. We have time for a few questions, I hope, right now, Walter. Actually, Katerina, this is very good because one of the questions that participants have posed is, what are the U.S. and Ukrainian efforts to counter cyber attacks? And you've kind of dealt with that great. I don't know if you want to add anything, but you've kind of zeroed in on that throughout your whole presentation. So I think we've kind of addressed that issue, unless you want to add something at the last minute now.
I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space, and closer engagement between these nations, both bilaterally and within a context of whatever NATO framework that Ukraine ends up working with, are very important. This is where early warning systems are incredibly important, so we can stop these threats closer to where they originate and conceptualize cybersecurity as collective security much more robustly.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Walter, Paul, and it's basically addressed to you, Paul. Walter makes reference to Radio Liberty and to the Voice of America. As you recall, during the Cold War years, they were very proactive in terms of fighting the propaganda that was coming out of the old Soviet Union. And Walter's question is, can their missions be revitalized now to deal with the Russian disinformation? So over to you, Paul.
Very, very quickly, the mission remains the same. The means of achieving that mission, however, need to be fundamentally transformed. We no longer use shortwave. We use primarily either FM, which requires in-country production, which doesn't always work in the way that people intend, and through the internet. It seems to me that both VOA and Radio Liberty have a role to play in Ukraine and elsewhere, and I'd like to see their efforts expanded, more programming, more expertise, and more communication of their findings, both in the direction of the East and the West. But there's another aspect to this issue, which Ostap made reference to, which I'd like to support, and that is there needs to be a vigorous effort to support genuine free media, both print and electronic, in Ukraine. That's something that should be handled internationally, and the United States should play a key role in providing education and, in fact, direct support for those kind of outlets. That's the other side is doing that. We need to do it as well.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. Walter, do we have time for another question?
Walter, you're on mute.
Walter, you're muted.
You're on mute. You're on
But I
mute.
know that the senator is getting online with us. So.
Yeah, I was about to say that with the senator getting online,
Okay.
I would have risked it, but I'm not sure.
I understand. Okay, so that concludes our panel. I'd like to thank Ostap and Paul and Katerina for their excellent presentations. And Walter, thank you for this opportunity once again to participate in your conference. So with that, we conclude this panel, and we'll turn it over to you because I know you have a hard stop for the 12:30 for the senator. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank everyone on this panel because it was like having a doctoral colloquia or seminar. It was just absolutely brilliant. And all three, as I've said, we've had 4 aces in each of our panels, and we're about to listen to another ace, someone. So thank you very much again for this panel.
Take care.
Take care.
Okay.
Take care to all of you.
Right.
Senator, I see you. I'm hoping that that the artist is there, your chair. Andrew, we have. Okay, so in this very, very important last session, or next to last session, we are going to be discussing. We've been talking about the new administration a lot, but there also is a reconstituted Senate, and there is into some ways a slightly different 117th Congress. And so get a sense of all of that, we're turning over to two individuals who had a lot to do with the Ukrainian issue specifically and Eastern Europe generally as a result of their work in the Helsinki Commission. I just wanted for myself to say, Oris, before you introduce the senator and introduce the session, that Senator Cardin is considered one of the great friends of Ukraine on the Hill, has been for a long, long time. So that's for me. Over to you, Oris, for this very important session.
Thank you, Walter. Welcome, Senator. It's so good to see you again. Walter, thanks to you and your team for organizing this terrific conference and for inviting me for what is a very pleasant task. It's truly a privilege for me to introduce Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, a champion of civil and human rights, both here in the United States and indeed around the world, and also my old boss who chaired or co-chaired the Helsinki Commission at various times when I was a staffer there. There's much I can say in introducing Senator Cardin, but in the interests of time and given the theme of this conference, I'll just highlight a few points. First, I should note that Senator Cardin is again assuming the Helsinki Commission chairmanship, and also that he's the second most senior Democrat on the enormously important Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Chairman Cardin has long been a strong supporter, as Walter mentioned, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He's been to Ukraine at least 3 times. I was privileged to accompany him each of those times when he was still a House member, shortly after the Orange Revolution in early 2005, then again in 2007 after he was already elected senator at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly annual session in Kyiv that brings together parliamentarians from all of the 57 OSCE countries, OSCE of course being the largest regional organization in the world. And while there, he also led our congressional delegation on a side visit, on a day trip, if you will, to Chernobyl, which was an unforgettable experience. And then again, in May 2014, when he and Senator Rob Portman were OSCE observers for the first post-Maidan presidential election. Of course, a few months earlier, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Senator Cardin was in the forefront of bipartisan congressional efforts in condemning Russia's egregious violations of a whole host of international agreements, including all 10 founding principles of the Helsinki Final Act. He chaired hearings on Ukraine at the Helsinki Commission, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, gave speeches on the Senate floor, statements, media appearances, met with many Ukrainian and allied officials, as well as, of course, with folks from our old administration. In July 2014, at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly annual session, his resolution condemning Russia for its illegal annexation of Crimea and occupation of the Donbass passed the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly by a substantial margin over what you can imagine were the vociferous objections of the Russian parliamentary delegation. The senator remains a strong supporter of assistance to Ukraine, both military and non-military, which also is vital to Ukraine's security and helps Ukraine become more resilient against Russia's ongoing aggression. I think sometimes that's kind of forgotten and soft-pedaled, but it's important, the non-security and non-military assistance as well. Senator Cardin has been the lead, I think, in the Senate on Russia sanctions legislation, including, of course, those related to their misdeeds in Ukraine. For example, the consequential public law, CATSA, Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and in pushing for its implementation by the Trump administration. And of course, Senator Cardin is well known as the author of the seminal Global Magnitsky Act, one of the most powerful tools in our global effort to protect human rights and fight corruption, as well as of the original Magnitsky Act, which specifically targeted human rights violators and corrupt officials in the Russian Federation. We're so pleased that you can take the time from your incredibly busy schedule to join us, Senator. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Orest, thank you for that very, very generous introduction. We miss you at the Helsinki Commission. Orest was our expert in this area, and he helped me so much to understand the complications of that region, the history of Ukraine and Russia, and just incredible service that he provided in his tenure, long tenure at the US Helsinki Commission. So, Orest, it's good to see you once again. I'm sorry we can't be in person, but that's the new reality until we get COVID-19 under control. Walter, thank you for putting on this extremely important dialogue between US and Ukraine, the security dialogue. It's very important, this relationship, not just as it relates to the future of Ukraine, but as it relates to the future of the region. And I might say some global issues about the importance of sovereignty and how we resolve issues of aggressive changing of borders. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to give you my perspective as to how I see things under the new Biden administration and under the new Congress. My perspective is very much from the point of view of being on the US Helsinki Commission. In this Congress, I'll chair the US Helsinki Commission. We rotate every 2 years between the House and the Senate. It's the Senate term. And since the Democrats are in majority by the election of Vice President Harris, I will have the gavel. But I want you to know, I don't think that will change very much at all the policies as it relates to the US-Ukraine issues, because there is no difference among Democrats or Republicans, and no difference among the leaders of the Helsinki Commission as to the importance of maintaining a very visible presence in regards to US-Ukraine relations. And I'll also give you my perspective from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I have the #2 seat on the Democratic side, and Senator Menendez will take on the chairmanship of that committee. Once again, I do not think that's going to change very much the focus or policy as it relates to Ukraine, because once again, it's been bipartisan support to help our friends in Ukraine in their efforts to get rid of the aggressive Russia incursion into their country. And then lastly, as Orest pointed out, I've been to Ukraine several times, and I've been able to see the spirit of the people during the revolution, the Maidan. It was just so energizing to see the spirit of the people of Ukraine for democracy and freedom and good governance. And I did have the opportunity to observe one of the elections with Senator Portman, as Orest pointed out. And we're so proud of the free and fair elections that are taking place in Ukraine. It is certainly a democratic state with challenges, and we will talk a little bit about this. So, from the US Helsinki Commission, as Orest pointed out, we have consistently used every opportunity within the Parliamentary Assembly to highlight the fact that Russia has violated every single one of the fundamental commitments of the Helsinki Final Act when it invaded Crimea, and its continued presence in the eastern part of Ukraine, and what it's doing to interrupt with the sovereignty of Ukraine. And we'll continue to do that. And we do not shy away from this. And the good thing about the Parliamentary Assembly as compared to the OSCE itself, we are not as restricted by the consensus mechanism. We can voice our views and take our votes, and we overwhelmingly have won every one of our votes to showcase that Russia is violating its commitments under the Helsinki Final Act. And in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I've used that position, working with Republicans and Democrats, to highlight the importance of taking action against Russia for its invasion. And we did, as the legislation that Orest mentioned. We've implemented sanctions, and we were the leaders. And as a result of US action, we were able to get European EU to follow us with the sanctions against Russia for its incursions into Ukraine. And we have supported robust US assistance to the Ukraine through the work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which has been very much demonstrated in the appropriation process. So all that has really helped me frame my own views on what we need to do with the Biden administration and what we can do in the Congress itself in order to further US security concerns, which would strengthen the relationship between the two countries and protect Ukraine from its incursion from Russia. So this year is the 30th anniversary, as I'm sure all of you are aware, since Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union, and we established diplomatic relations between our two countries. We cannot allow Russia to change borders by force. It's not just Ukraine that's at stake. It is clear that we have to stand up in Ukraine on this principle. Otherwise, we know exactly what state actors like Russia will do in regards to other border dispute areas. They will use force in order to take over territory, and we cannot allow that to happen. And we need to draw the line now very clearly, and Ukraine is clearly Exhibit A. The sovereignty and territorial integrity is part of the fundamental principles of the Helsinki Final Act. So we're clear Russia's violations, and it's critical to international security order. So first and foremost, I think you'll find from the Biden administration very clear language that they will use and very clear action they will use in regards to what Russia did in Ukraine. And I can quote from President Biden on February 26th, just a few days ago, on the 7th anniversary of Russia's incursion into Crimea, where President Biden said, "The U.S. continues to stand with Ukraine and its allies and partners today, as it has from the beginning of the conflict. On this sober anniversary, we reaffirm a simple truth: Crimea is Ukraine." So I think you're going to see very clear and unambiguous statements, whether it is what he says in this type of an occasion on the anniversary of the incursion, or what he says in a bilateral conversation with Mr. Putin, what he says at international meetings. You're going to see a consistent message coming from the President of the United States to the global community that Russia's behavior will never be recognized, and we will stand with the people of Ukraine on the sovereignty of Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, and we want the Russian presence to be removed as soon as possible. The human scale tragedy that's been caused by Russia is something that we always need to point out, because we really need to put a face on the misery and damage that they have caused to the people of Ukraine. 13,000 have lost their lives. Tens of thousands have been wounded. We have 1.4 million Ukrainians that are currently displaced. Families are separated. Sick people cannot get medical care. And the list goes on and on and on about what Russia has caused by what it's done in Ukraine. And it's continuing. It's not ended. We're not this is not a Cold War from the point of view that we have a stable situation. It's getting worse. We've seen 2 large-scale live fire exercises in eastern Ukraine by Russia. We've seen Ukraine block the OSCE special monitoring mission from being able to carry out its functions. So we know what's going on in these areas. We have an independent view. In Donbass, Russia is requiring the local citizenry to take out Russian passports in order to be able to do business. The Russian opposition to what they're doing in these areas, those individuals have been harassed, tortured, imprisoned, etc. And Russia is using a media propaganda campaign to just mislead the people of the region. All that requires us to do more in order to help the people of Ukraine. Ukraine has suffered economic and loss as a result of the incursion. The energy security issues are very much involved. Ukraine has lost access to its natural gas resources. And with Russia pursuing the Nord Stream 2 project, it adds additional threats to Ukraine. So, first part of what you'll see come out of this new Congress and new president is clear, unambiguous statements about Russia's behavior in Ukraine will never be accepted. Secondly, you'll see that we want Russia to pay a price. Yes, in the diplomatic circles by being isolated and being ostracized from the point of view of what it's done, but also to pay a financial penalty. Congress has passed very clear sanctions against Russia. We want those sanctions to be enforced, including the pursuit of Nord Stream 2. There's clear sanctions that need to be imposed, and we will be seeking not only the United States to impose these sanctions, but our allies in Europe to join us in imposing sanctions against Russia and those companies that are violating these policies. So we will also use the mechanisms that we have available, and Boris has mentioned some of those. Clearly, I am pleased to see Mr. Putin pay so much attention to the Magnitsky sanctions that he raised it as the first issue when he met with President Trump. We want to see the Magnitsky sanctions used in regards to the bad actors in Ukraine. We have legislation in, Senator Wicker and I, to make permanent the global Magnitsky statute and to strengthen the global Magnitsky statute. And we are so pleased that we've seen not only some of our very reliable partners always, such as Canada and the Baltic states, to pass global Magnitsky, but now the EU and UK, now EU has passed the global Magnitsky statute. So we're very pleased about that. To supplement that, Senator Wicker and I have introduced legislation that would establish a fund to fight corruption, and we think that can help very much Ukraine. And Senator Young and I have introduced legislation that would look at every country in the world as to how well they're dealing with fighting corruption. I say that because Ukraine must act in its national security interest against Russia, but it also needs to be attentive to its own internal problems. So top on my list, that what we will expect from Ukraine will be to deal with judicial reform, the protecting the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and the influence of oligarchs. In other words, Ukraine must be on a constant path towards good governance. And yes, one of the things that we will clearly be doing is providing robust bilateral aid to Ukraine. We've done that in the past. I think it's about $275 million that's in the current pipeline. But don't be surprised. In fact, I will encourage us to make some of those funds contingent upon progress being made in fighting the corruption that is systemic in their system, and to deal with the challenges of their judiciary and what they did with the Anti-Corruption Bureau. And of course, this is important not only for the future of Ukraine as a democratic state and the protection of the rights of its people, but it's also going to be required by international organizations such as IMF in regards to financial commitments that they will give. So we need to help. And I think the bilateral aid can help. I think these new bills that I'm talking about in Congress can help provide the climate in which Ukraine can make those types of progress and good governance. So it's clearly in our national security interest to build on the partnership between our two countries, to stand up to Russia's aggression, to make it clear we will not tolerate it in Ukraine, and we will not tolerate it any place in the use of force to change borders. And we need to make that very clear. We need to impose sanctions against Russia for its malign behavior, and we need to provide help, but also incentives for Ukraine to continue along the path of good governance and fighting the corruption in their own country. I think we can build on all of that. I expect it to be very bipartisan in Congress, and I think it's going to be a very positive relationship between our two countries. With that, Oris, I'll turn it back to you and be glad to take a few friendly questions before I go back to the floor of the Senate to take up President Biden's $1.9 trillion package, which includes, by the way, some foreign involvement in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, Senator, for all of your words and for what's truly a very clear, comprehensive, and strong remarks in support of Ukraine. And indeed, all of your work over the years in support of human rights and democracy, peace and security around the world. I'm not seeing any chats. I think you've answered everybody's question, but I don't want to quite let you. I know you still have 4 minutes, and Debbie set a hard deadline, and yeah. So let me just start out with one. Actually, good. I will not use the chair prerogative.
Yeah, I saw the question. I saw the question.
Former Ambassador Bill Courtney, who was our ambassador to both Georgia and Kazakhstan back in the 90s. So the question basically, how should Biden balance relations with Germany and Nord Stream 2?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Germany's wrong. I put it pretty simply. Germany is wrong. And I've had lots of conversations with my counterparts from Germany, including from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We don't want to jeopardize at all the activities within Germany. They're our strong ally, the strongest state in regards to EU conduct. So we want to work with Germany, but Nord Stream 2 is really against our interest, our national security interest. And it is not for a safer Europe. So I think there are alternatives, and I think we have to look at alternatives. There's paths forward in which we can try to mitigate some of the immediate issues to give the companies an opportunity to change direction. But this is an area where I think we have to work with our German friends, but they need to understand that Nord Stream 2 is not in the security interests of the Western alliance.
Thank you, Senator. I see another question from Ostap Krivdik from Ukraine, who used to be Speaker Parubi's chief foreign policy advisor, by the way, Ukrainian Speaker Parubi's. And he asks, is there a chance for a joint anti-corruption plan to chase Ukraine's corrupt money in the West, tackling the enablers? And I think you touched upon some legislation that we're planning on that.
Well, first, we want Ukraine to have an independent judiciary. We want them to have an anti-corruption bureau that can work on a consistent path of progress to make it clear that you don't have to buy services in Ukraine as citizens, that bribery is not going to ever be acceptable, that we're going to have an independent judiciary, independent prosecutors, which will have the resources necessary. We will not tolerate corruption from any public official, and we will not tolerate corruption in the private sector. So that message has to be clear, and that takes time, and it has to come from Ukraine itself. But then what we can do as a sort of carrot stick approach, in one of the bills that I filed will have actually a fund available to help countries in establishing this. But even our bilateral help or the multilateral institutions can help Ukraine in instituting these reforms. So there will be a positive incentive, but there will also be negatives. The Global Magnitsky Act allows us to impose sanctions on use of banking and on visa issuance for those who participate in corruption that are not penalized by their own country. So we can take action under the Magnitsky statute to identify those oligarchs who are participating in this corrupt system. And once we take away their ability to participate in the banking system or travel, we usually can have some significant positive consequences.
Thank you. I see. Do you have time for one more question? Or
sure, that'll be fine. Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any from the state. Let me just ask one then. What do you see in terms of prospects for additional sanctions legislation on Russia for its malign activities, not only in Ukraine, but in the US and all around the world, of course? Or is the legislation itself right now pretty good and it's more a question of its implementation?
Orest, I think it's the latter. I think we have pretty strong sanction regimes that are out there. It's now applying that. We know that President Trump did not have a consistent message with Mr. Putin, and that's being probably the understatement of the day. And Mr. Trump did not impose all the sanctions he could. We did something that is unprecedented in Congress when we took away from the president the ability to remove sanctions without working with Congress. So there was that relationship that was uncomfortable between the Trump administration and Mr. Putin. So I think with an administration that recognizes Russia's maligned activities and we have to stand by our principles, I think you'll see the Biden administration use the tools that are available much more effectively. So I'm not sure we need to give any additional tools. I would also mention we really need to work with Europe on this. It only works if we can get the Europeans to go along with us on the sanctions, and that's going to require some diplomacy. And I think you'll see that also come from the Biden administration.
Okay, thank you so much again, Senator. I don't know, Walter, if you want to conclude with anything before the senator goes, but I can't thank you enough. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the organizers. You know, I was just a participant, but for Walter and everybody, that we're extremely, extremely grateful for you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thanks so much. It was so great to see you again.
It's great to see you all. Everybody stay safe. Walter, again, thank you for putting on this program, and I look forward to working with you all. Stay well, everybody.
Walter, make sure you unmute.
I was about to tell the senator that he has a standing invitation to come to any one of our subsequent conferences, but
I got the message. Thanks.
Oh, okay, thank you, thank you, sir. So with this, it looks like Maryland, artist. Thank you very much, because it looks like Maryland is truly popular for us today, because we're about to now complete our wonderful mission, our dialogue with another representative of the U.S. government from Maryland, Representative Andy Harris, and also our with that, I would also ask for Andrew Foutet, who happens to be the president of the Ukrainian Congress. And Andrew, I would ask you to do this. You will almost play the role of a chair. You will take over the session. We'll introduce our good friend, Representative Harris. And then I think at the end, you will have your own, I guess, that's the way we had sort of envisioned it, to thank everybody and to sort of wrap it up from our perspective, from let's say the diaspora perspective on all of this. Can we do it that way, or
that works for me very well?
Okay, because I would have loved it, especially Representative Harris. So I'm personally going to say I'm very, very grateful, because every time that I've actually reached out to him, I don't think he's ever refused us. So I want to express my personal thank you to Representative Harris, but it's all yours, then. Okay.
Well, thank you. Well, from one side of the United States Congress to the other side, we have with us in dedicating a keynote at the very end, not only a key leader for our community, but a key leader on the Ukraine issue, co-chair of the Congressional Ukrainian Caucus, somebody who is also of Ukrainian and Hungarian heritage. So as they say, Vinya Nash, he is, but somebody that, honestly, and everything we try to do on the Hill, again, one of those prime examples of somebody who always finds the time to meet with almost everybody he comes across, takes the leadership in terms of legislation, takes the leadership in terms of participating and communicating with us. So it's really an honor to share not only the closing remarks, but to share this opportunity to introduce to you the representative for Maryland, Andy Harris.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, and thank you for letting me participate this year again. Again, like Senator Cardin said, I wish it were in person, but we'll have to make do with what we have. Just following up on Senator Cardin, it's been a pleasure to work with him. I've traveled with the OSCE PA now for 2 years. Obviously, this year we haven't been traveling, but I've traveled as an alternate to the delegation. He's absolutely right. That delegation is firmly supportive of Ukraine. We frequently come to loggerheads with the Russian delegation there, but we find that the vast majority, of course, of those 57 countries in the OSCE EPA do agree that Ukraine needs protection, it needs support, and have supported it. So I look forward to working with Senator Cardin on the US Helsinki Commission. Again, I'm not a member, I travel as an alternate, but it's been a pleasure working with him. Let me just briefly comment, since now we've changed administrations, about what my view is about what's happened over the past 4 years and where we go into the future. I think that on several different areas, the Trump administration made very good progress on our support for Ukraine. Let me start first of all, when they took over, clearly the eastern Ukraine conflict had been going on for a couple of years. The United States had provided some aid, but not probably the most important aid or most important signal to Russia. Lethal military aid was not included, but the Trump administration started to. And to the Biden administration credit, it's continued that, of course, with the report 3 days ago that $125 million of military equipment has been sent to Ukraine, including 2 patrol boats, obviously very important in the naval part of what Ukraine needs. So that was a great accomplishment, and I hope that continues. And from all indications, the bipartisan support in Congress for lethal military aid to help Ukraine fight Russian aggression in the eastern provinces was an important move. Second, the Trump administration did what I call restored the U.S. military. This is incredibly important because, as I've said many times, the U.S., if you just have to look at the map of the world, is surrounded by 2 oceans and 2 friendly nations, Canada and Mexico. Our U.S. military does not exist for the protection of America's borders. It does that also, but the size and scope of the U.S. military is what it is to protect the borders of our allies. And we've done that now for nearly 100 years. And I think we're going to continue to do that. And we're better able to do it because of the military restoration. I hope that the Biden administration and the 117th Congress continue the support of restoring America's military. Incredibly important to that end, perhaps more important to the United States than Ukraine, is the modernization of our nuclear forces. I think the Trump administration was bold to back out of the START treaty, to say that the Russians, as the world has more or less acknowledged, has been cheating on the treaty, and that a treaty is no good unless both sides are willing to enforce the treaty. It remains to be seen, what path the Biden administration takes, but I think a healthy skepticism of Russia's willingness to abide by nuclear treaties should always be taken by any American administration. And I think the Trump administration started that. I hope the Biden administration continues it. And I hope the 117th Congress recognizes the importance of that. The third thing that was undertaken by the Trump administration was what I call the Eastern movement of the European front for the United States. In a very controversial move, President Trump decided to begin moving troops and forces from Germany eastward into Poland. I think what this signaled is the recognition is that the Eastern front of the struggle against Russia now, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and Russia now, is the Ukrainian-Russian border right now. And I think in recognition of that, I think that sent a strong signal that we recognize that the Baltic states and Ukraine have to be protected from Russian aggression. And merely the physical movement of troops sent that signal. Again, I hope the Biden administration continues that, and the 117th Congress does. Now, let's talk a little bit about Nord Stream 2, because I think that the economic interest and viability of Ukraine and its government to some extent depend upon whether or not the revenues from gas transport across Ukraine continue. Nord Stream 2 would be a significant geopolitical move by Russia to potentially adversely impact, as everyone recognizes. I do think that the Trump administration took too long to institute sanctions on Nord Stream 2, but they did. and it actually stopped progress on Nord Stream 2 for a while. I'm a little disappointed that the Biden administration, in a report in Bloomberg on the 19th of February, it was reported that they were not willing to extend the sanctions to the German companies that continue to help support the continuation and completion of Nord Stream 2. I agree with Senator Cardin that Germany is on the wrong side of this argument. I think the United States needs to take a very strong position and sanction any company that attempts to complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, whether it's a Russian company or a German company. I think that there is no good solution that would involve the completion of that pipeline, because in the end, the ability of Russia to deliver energy into Europe and make Central Europe and dependent upon Russian energy resources will mean that the threat to potentially for Germany potentially, for instance, to be able to turn off flow in that pipeline is probably a hollow threat, because once Central Europe becomes dependent upon Russian gas, it will be virtually impossible to stop that dependency. So again, I would hope that we in fact strengthen the sanctions and finally drive a stake through the heart of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. One last issue that is of some concern going forward is the penetration of Chinese interests and the interests of the Chinese government in Ukraine. Now, to some extent, China around the world, through its Belt and Road Initiative, merely fills a vacuum of capital that are left when other countries choose not to invest in some of the countries, for instance, like Ukraine or Africa or Asia, that are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is somewhere where we have to make an effort to say, for countries that are geopolitically as significant as Ukraine, we have to be willing to go head to head with the Chinese in the willingness to make capital investments to move Ukraine's economy forward. And whatever that takes, we need to have to do it, because again, this is one more area of the world where China and the US interests compete. And I think in the end, we have to flex our economic muscle. I will say that a couple of things have deflected our attention from Eastern Europe. One of them, of course, is COVID now, where it appears our interest is almost consumed with COVID to some extent, as it should be, but never losing the bigger picture that when this pandemic is over, we have to make sure we have the world in a geopolitical position that we want it in, and not to have lost sight of things during the COVID pandemic. The other thing I believe is that although the Obama administration had frequently talked about a pivot to Asia, I think pivot to Asia implies that you're going to move everything, all your attention there, and perhaps neglect other areas of the globe. I think we need to extend interest, certainly to keep an eye on what China does, especially in the South China Sea and vis-a-vis Japan, Taiwan, et cetera. But we can never lose focus from, again, the significant threat that an empowered Russia would leave on the geopolitics of the world. So with that, I think we've made a lot of advances in the past 4 years. Again, Nord Stream 2 is one of the outliers that we need to deal with as soon as possible, because once that pipeline is completed, I think the die is cast, and I think in a very negative way. But in other areas, we just merely need to continue what's been done by the last administration. I think improving on what had been done by the Obama administration, and again, keeping that forged alliance between Ukraine and the United States vigorous. I will just end by saying, and I'm certainly willing to take questions, that the observation is, again, that you have heard widely, that there is broad bipartisan support for Ukraine, for its territorial integrity, for wanting to see the democratic process invigorated and broadened in Ukraine, that clearly exists in the 117th Congress, just like it did in the 116th. You know, in an era where everyone talks about partisanship, and poisonous partisanship, this is one area, the topic of Ukraine and support of Ukraine, where broad bipartisanship clearly exists. And I think that bodes very well for the future of Ukraine as a country and as a US ally. And with that, those are my comments. And again, I'd be more than happy to answer questions if anyone has them.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for raising the issue of the progress that's been made in terms of the military partnership over the last years in terms of Ukraine and the United States. Thank you for raising the issues of the continued enforcement of sanctions, and particularly the stance on Nord Stream, as well as bringing up the fact of the matter is that we need to take a look at the threat that China poses to us all. So Walter, do you want to have one or two questions before I close, or how do you want to handle this?
Again, your mic, Walter.
Walter, you're on mute.
I'm saying usually the closing remarks have been standalones that are closing remarks. But in the case of Representative Harris, yes, if there are we didn't warn the audience about it, but if there are questions, yes, I actually would have one, but I prefer it to.
I have not seen anything posted, so why don't you, Walter, go ahead with the question?
Yeah, Representative Harris, on the issue of what the Europeans are doing and what the Europeans have been doing throughout the period, in the last and especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, despite getting insulted in Moscow, their representative getting insulted in Moscow. Is there anything that Congress can do? I know that diplomacy can be done by the executive branch, but is there anything that Congress can do, or in your different roles and so on and so forth, that can exert some sort of pressure on the Europeans to start behaving in some of these areas, or is that something that that Congress has to stand aside?
No, so for instance, the Appropriations Authority is uniquely and solely a congressional authority.
Right.
And in fact, we have exercised that authority. We have taken the lead occasionally from the executive branch on saying that, yes, we are going to set the amount of aid. We're going to make sure that it can include, for instance, lethal military aid. And then we need to take a position. So when we take a position of leadership on that, I think it sends a clear signal. For instance, us providing lethal military aid to Ukraine, I think sent a clear signal to the rest of Europe that we view the Russian interference as aggression. We view it as an attack on an ally of the United States. And I think it sends the message that it should be viewed the same way by our NATO allies in Europe. So the Congress and the 117th Congress, I guarantee, as Senator Cardin has suggested, I guarantee will be as vigorous in its support, financial support for Ukraine as it has been in the past. Now, he has suggested that we might attach some strings to some of this, but I'm sure that anything we do, any contingencies we place on that support, I think should be readily achievable by Ukraine, and I think they will find it desirable to make some of those reforms that he had suggested would be tied to future aid. I think that they'll make those reforms, and if they do and make progress toward them, they will find no better ally than the 117th Congress.
Good. So appropriations is a tool, as I understand.
Absolutely, absolutely. Not only in the amount of the appropriation, but in the direction of where we believe how that appropriation should go.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Andrea.
Thank you for letting me join you today.
Looks like we don't have any other further questions. So with that, Congressman, as always, my friend, thank you. Thanks. And we look forward to what we see as a long list of objectives and a lot of things that get done in this 117th. And we will continue to count on your guidance, your leadership, and working together with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Look forward to this in person at some point in the future.
Let's hope so.
Thank you very much.
Great. Let me conclude then with, as Walter says, the closing remarks and a little perspective from the organized Ukrainian American community. Indeed, it was an honor for me to share the closing statements here with my friend, the Honorable U.S. Representative for Maryland, Andy Harris, co-chair of the Congressional Ukrainian Caucus. After these 2 days of presentations and lively discussions, it falls on us to place this 12th U.S.-Ukraine security dialogue in a broader context. And in doing so, hopefully inspire some of you, or hopefully all of you, to action, knowing what you have learned and heard these past 2 days. On January 20th, the 46th President of the United States was sworn in, and the new 117th Congress has begun its work. The Ukrainian American community looks to the United States to not only live up to its public and binding security guarantees to Ukraine, but to further develop that strategic relationship as a buffer against rogue nations threatening the collective security order. As such, we strongly believe that security of the US lies in the expansion of democracy and mutual security guarantees. And as such, the Ukrainian American community will advocate both in the US Congress and in administration for the United States to take the following actions. Uphold a clear, unified, steadfast, and explicit commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and independence by the US and our European allies. Ukraine's territorial integrity is non-negotiable, and any change to it cannot be discussed while parts of it are under threat and occupation by the Russian Federation. We need to reject all forms of recognition of Russian rule over the illegally occupied Crimean Peninsula by adhering to objectives which were explicitly stated in the Crimean Declaration of July of 2018. And we urge a very quick passage of the Crimean Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which was sponsored by Representatives Connolly and Shabbat in a bipartisan basis. We demand the immediate withdrawal of both covert and overt Russian forces and equipment from Ukraine, and compliance with the ceasefire agreements. Expand direct military assistance, including lethal defensive arms, naval and air force support, which is very critical, and additional military training programs. Continue the open door policy through implementation of a membership action plan map for eventual NATO membership for Ukraine. Maintain and strengthen targeted economic sanctions against the Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. And here we're going to get into discussion of something that some folks may believe is taking it a step too far, but in our opinion, this is important, including a ban on U.S. financial institutions to purchase Russian sovereign debt instruments, and revoking Russia from the SWIFT international transaction network until it fully complies with its international obligations, including the Budapest Memorandum. This includes also expanding and implementing the Magnitsky Act. As has been talked about much, expand and enforce the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions that eventually will put a stop to the construction. Monitor and ramp up US counter-narrative objectives to the Russian propaganda through the already established Global Engagement Center, which is at the US State Department. Enhance the US-Ukraine strategic partnership to include comprehensive support of Ukraine's defense capacity, economic reform efforts, anti-corruption measures, and foreign direct investment opportunities. It is clear that Ukraine is at a critical juncture in its true Euro-Atlantic integration. After nearly 2 years since Ukraine's presidential election of May 2019, political parties in Ukraine are struggling to bring forth their issues to the electorate. It is essential that the United States remains actively involved and continues to advocate for democratic principles and a strategic outlook for enhanced relations with Ukraine. Nearly 30 years of Ukrainian independence have brought 9 US ambassadors as envoys of American diplomacy. Unfortunately, Ukraine has been without an American envoy since the summer of 2019. The Ukrainian American community praises the efforts and commitment of the previous US ambassadors to Ukraine in ensuring that Ukraine develops into a truly democratic state, grounded in international norms and principles of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, ensconced in a prosperous market economy. But the time has come for the United States to continue assisting Ukraine at this most important junction of transformation with an envoy in Kyiv. We have a chance to assist Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to be a strong democratic nation with all the methods and technologies to continue self-improvement. On behalf of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, I would like to thank once again Walter, Andriy, and the organizers, the sponsors, the moderators, the participants for a job extremely well done. Thank you for being so informative. Slava Ukraini, and God bless America.
Thank you, Andriy. Thank you very much, Andriy. I knew that you, as always, a wonderful wrap up and actually a wonderful end to our dialogue. I think from the first word to the last word, and I'm going to hand it over to Andriy to close it down. But from the first word to the last word, this security dialogue has probably been the most perfect of all, because it really has. There was not a misstep, even with Mr. Moshevets. He managed to get his information to us, so that by this morning we were able to broadcast his presentation. So with that, all I can say is that I'm hoping, I'm going to leave it with the words that were given to us by Ms. Hanna Hopko, that in 2029, in the town of Lutsk, when Ukraine is about to accede to NATO, in a town that 600 years ago had a meeting of all the great European monarchs who knew that there were all sorts of threats to Europe and were hoping to harmonize their own attitudes, that we will all meet in Lutsk for the 19th security dialogue and celebrate our good fortune of having finally achieved what is a truly noble ambition, and that is to become part of the Euro-Atlantic community, a full member, both in Europe and in NATO. So with that, I just want to say to everyone, the audience especially, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Andrew, can you just very briefly explain to everybody that this can be, and I mean it, your recordings may end up being, I don't want to overstate it, but may become historical documents at some point. They're important. We had, the people that we had on today are going to be making a lot of policy in the next couple of years, all of us. So I think it was, it's imperative for you to give everybody a little bit of an explanation at the very, very end about where they can get the copies of this and where we're going to be putting them. Okay.
It's even more than where they can get it, because we know as of overnight, we probably had more views than expected from the YouTube live stream that is up on UCCA's YouTube page, which you can find at UCCA Tube. If you search on YouTube, and that we probably our Australian friends, maybe our friends in Ukraine, some students at Kyiv Mohila, but it was certainly viewed again and again last night. So that was all of yesterday's session. And then you can also view everything that we're seeing today. For those of you who are participating in the Zoom webinar, you can get, in the follow-up email that'll come to you tomorrow as a registrant, you will also get the links for both today's session and yesterday's session on YouTube, as well as on Facebook, so you can share that. Eventually, we'll also be editing those down to individual panels. So if you want to share something specific, I'd like to add to Walter's thanks of everybody who participated today. Also thanking our patrons, without whom we cannot put this on without any cost to you. So our sincere thanks to the Self-Reliance Federal Credit Union of New York, the Badushni's Credit Union, the Heritage Foundation of First Securities Federal Savings Bank, and the Zaryckyj Family Fund. All of these have been supporting the security dialogue for years. And whether you're attending in person in Washington, D.C., or looking online, it's through their generous support. So we thank them sincerely, in addition to the co-sponsoring organizations, which are, again, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the Center for US-Ukrainian Relations, as well as the American Foreign Policy Council. In addition to all the speakers, I would like to also highlight the fact that we had a wonderful speaker today, Katya Sudova, and I'm going to highlight her because she was somebody who attended these security dialogues back when she was an activist at the Ukrainian Association of Washington State. So for all of those who are attending today, and I'd like to point out that Mr. Andriy Ninka from the Ukrainian Weekly has been asking questions both yesterday and today. We appreciate those of us. I saw Petro Kostolik yesterday from both the Organization in Defense of Lubkivshchina as well as the Ukrainian American Youth Association. Thank you for your participation in terms of asking questions. And anybody who asked the questions, so you know, we have compiled those and sent them along to the speakers. Even if you did not hear an answer, your question gets to them in the end and may affect them for the future conference. Another thing, Walter, 2 years ago at the Security Dialogue in DC, we had a big discussion about naval policies right before the blow up in the Black Sea. We were warning people, we had experts on warning about the naval component of this war that hadn't erupted. And then at our Security Dialogue is when we were warning things that later happened that summer. I think this year we had a cyber session that we haven't had before, and maybe we're prescient this time. So I'm glad we have that great bunch of experts. Ostap, disinformation with Paul Goebel. This is part of the war. So perhaps last year we were thinking that the air war would be the next war, but it may be that cyber is what we're going to concentrate on going forward. That's as much as I can summarize, but everybody who is registered today, you will get a link to all the YouTube and Facebook videos. Please like those videos online and on Facebook. Try to subscribe to either Walter's emails, UCCA's regular emails. AFPC does a wonderful job, if you're on their mailing list, of doing write-ups for all regions of the world. I learn more about China through their programs than probably anywhere else. So please look at our co-sponsoring organizations' email lists, and you can probably get more in line of what our next conferences will be like.
Thank you very much, Andriy. To both Andriys, thank you very much. And so I want to salute my co-sponsor, the UCCA. And the fact is, the center with Mick and myself and with your team, we're planning, and I know I might as well advertise that our next get-together is the annual report card. And we already have it projected. Ukraine's annual report card should be very interesting this year. We're getting set to get as strong a set of panelists and graders as we've had in the last 3 or 4 conferences. It really has gotten to the point where this attracts a very good audience. It also attracts the very best presenters. So with that, till June 17th and 18th, 2021, I got to remember that it's 21 at this point. I bid all of you goodbye. Thank you very much, Andriy and Andriy. Дякую.
Thank you.